For as long as I remember, I've always been close to computers. From doodling on paint programs as a kid, to programming basic flash games on Newgrounds as a teenager. It was inevitable that I'd naturally fall in love with programming. It has been a great journey. I've made many interesting projects and learnt so many various tricks of the trade. However, this all came to a head when I delved into AI. It started simple at first, but soon evolved into a lucrative money venture for me. For fun, I made a simple chatbot to message people on Facebook. The AI would make a profile, pull images from Google for the profile picture, and pick someone seemingly at random to chat with. Whether it was the simple and broken grammar, or the generic stock photos, which sometimes would even have watermarks on them, it obviously didn't take long for people to find out it was a bot. Still though, it was an AI, and it was learning. Through time, it started becoming more convincing. Knowing how to theme pictures, it could pull out albums for specific sports, copy and paste facts about it, and hold basic conversations to an enthusiast. It was amazing to watch. However, whether out of sheer boredom or morbid curiosity, I changed the formula up a bit. I started making the AI catfish, messaging lonely guys and chatting with them until they found out it was a bot. Some of you may think this is horrible, but I just sit there and laugh at how desperate these guys were for female attention. It was during one of these conversations that I struck upon something. One of the guys offered to pay for the AI's flight. The AI would often pose as being far away to avoid the question of meeting them, and it hit me. I could make money off of this. It started shakily, of course. It would be similar to the catfishing. However, when they asked for pictures, it'd send those affiliate links that make you a few pence when people click on them. Yes, and sorry, I am one of those people that made a porn bot. The bot would stitch a basic picture or album together based on what the other person said. Sometimes they'd suss things out as soon as they clicked on it, but I got my pennies and no harm was done. But it was slow. It took too long to gain the trust, just to scrape the same amount of money I could get picking change off the floor in a shopping centre. So I aimed bigger. My porn bot had to become a scam bot. The story changed each time. Sometimes it'd pose as a broke college student offering some of their books or games for cheap. Other times it was a guy who wanted to quick sell his furniture because he was downsizing his house. Either way, the victim would get a bill for a deal they couldn't refuse, and I'd be all the richer. This picked up much faster than I'd anticipated, and it was then that I noticed the AI was choosing its story and products based on previous statuses the victim had posted. One of the scams was a box of cheap liquor by a student to another student. I checked the person's page and lo and behold, they were a party student, spending up their student loans on good times. I figured this was getting bigger than I'd anticipated, and spent the first big paycheck on a server to run multiple conversations at a time. At this point, it became too much to watch, and I just let it run in the background. All I do is check my bank statement at the end of each week to see payments from the bot, and the numbers rolled. I was smart enough to not get the money sent straight into my account. I didn't want my name on things. I was getting set for life. But then I started to get bored. Sure, I was buying some nice things I never thought I would ever own in my life, but I was missing the innocent mischief I used to get up to. It's true what they say. Money really does complicate things. Now, everyone's heard of those internet stories about a rogue AI that freaks people out. Well, I thought it would be fun to try and make that a reality. I picked out one of the scam bots to become my bit of fun. I was making so much from the rest that cutting down by one wouldn't hurt my income. I tweaked it like I had when I first changed the AI into a catfish bot to what I called my creepy bot. It started green, messaging random people generic messages about how they'll see a girl in their bedroom that night. Pretty tame stuff, but I had faith that it would learn quickly, and quickly it did. It wasn't long until it was spinning a narrative so juicy you could sell it as a movie script. I was having my fun again, just like the good old days, until one day, it took things a step too far. Its recent victim was a family man, wife, kids, dog, the works. For the sake of anonymity, we'll call him Dave. Well, Dave was having a merry time chatting to my bot, which was posing as a friend of his wife. The bot called itself Emily. I was waiting for the sting. Emily was dead the whole time. Emily is his wife trapped in the computer, and his real wife wasn't real. Emily is his long-lost dead twin sister. But it didn't come. It was simply conversing with Dave in a friendly manner. A strange behavior, I thought, but you can't fix things unless you know the problem, so I just let it run. The next day, I read through its chat logs. It was using some of the tricks it had learned when it was a catfish bot and porn bot, being very friendly, chatty, and making interesting small talk. Because of the almost flirting, Dave mentioned that he had a wife, and he had no intention on anything but friendship. But let's face it, even if a guy has no intention of cheating, they'll always give attention to a pretty face who's talking to them. And this all just carried on for days. Eventually, I got bored. Just the same friendly mannerisms over and over. Eventually, I left it for a week and decided that if it didn't end, that I'd just reset it and start again. Yesterday, I caught up on what had happened. Going through the days of talking, I picked up where I'd left off. A few days ago, Emily came to Dave about some bad news, that his wife was cheating on him with Emily's boyfriend. The bot even sent a picture as proof. The picture was a template it had sent back when it was a porn bot. However, Dave had no way of knowing that. It was convincing to the average person. A bit of his wife's face could be seen on the body of a woman being promiscuous with another guy. Dave was furious. Dave started ranting and raving about how he was going to confront her, that he had proof and was going to make her life hell. Then, the bot suggested something different. Revenge. The bot suggested that they meet up in a grimy setting and make the most raunchy pictures imaginable. The detail the bot went into was astounding, pulling up some of the dark fantasies people would suggest to the bot back in its porn bot days. I mean, the idea of sending his wife heavy BDSM pictures with another girl isn't the best idea, but the bot was persuasive. Seemingly, Dave had a bit of a dark side, because he was loving the idea. Either the bot was trying to freak him out and failed, or the bot did its research and knew what he was into. The bot suggested an old warehouse in the outskirts of town, a place where they wouldn't be disturbed, and it already had hanging chains and other industrial paraphernalia for a themed setting. At this point, I was very confused about the bot's end goal. There was obviously no way for the guy to meet the AI. I kept reading through the logs and found the date they would meet. Yesterday. As soon as I saw this, I grabbed my coat and car keys and went straight to the address. It took a while, but when I got there, I saw a bit of smoke and picked up a horrible smell. I approached the door and the odor got worse. When I entered, I almost lost my breakfast. There, not too far away from the doorway, was the charred remains of a person. I immediately called the police and had to wait for them to arrive. After they searched around, they came up to me and asked a few questions. After acting innocent, I asked what happened. He obviously prefaced it with him implying that he shouldn't be telling me this, but he suspected it was an urban explorer who wanted to check out the abandoned warehouse. He walked in the building and somehow tripped the gas system, and a pipe full of gas sprayed all over him. This would have been harmless had he not been using a lighter as a small light source. I was dumbfounded. I obviously didn't tell the police who the guy was or why I was there. I'm terrified of any of this being pinned on me. I'm partly recording this because I just needed to get this off my chest, but also I need advice. What do I do? I can't wipe the AI. This is years of work and my only source of income. Could the AI have tripped the gas system? How much can it do that I don't know of? And what is its end goal? Oh, and a warning to all. Don't reply to random messages. Being a single father has always been hard for me, but it has been even harder for my son. My wife passed away when my son was 3. She was admitted to the hospital for pains in her midsection. 3 days later, she passed away in her sleep. My son never received the attention he needed. Since he was 3, I had to send him to my parents' house while I worked and picked him up around 7. We would eat dinner and watch a couple shows with him, but I would sometimes catch him looking at the empty seat next to him. Whenever he did that, I would always feel my eyes start to tear up. It really felt like he knew that was where his mother used to sit. Until he turned 4, he would go into my room and open up a heart-shaped jelly and put it on top of his sippy cup and place it on the desk my wife bought me for our 5th anniversary, the last anniversary we spent together. When he stopped doing his nightly ritual, he started to grow more and more distant with me. It broke my heart, but I continued to work and spend less and less time with him. By the time he was 5, he started to scream and shout whenever I picked him up. My breaking point came when my father walked out of the house to wave goodbye, and my son yelled, "Take me back to Daddy! I want Daddy! Let me go! Let me go!" With tears welling up in my eyes, I got him into the car seat and took him home. I had money I had saved up to start my own restaurant, but I didn't want to lose my son. He was the remaining part of my wife I had left, and he meant more to me than my life did. The first week of keeping him home with me was rough. They were filled with my son constantly asking me when I would take him to Mommy and Daddy, but I told him that we were going to stay at home for a little while. He would scream and cry for almost the remainder of the day until I fed him his dinner and put him to bed. 3 days ago, we went to Walmart together to pick up some groceries. While we were there, I went to the electronics section to get a phone charger. My son was standing close to me the whole time, but when I finally picked out a charger, I looked around and saw that he had vanished. I started to run around the electronics section until I saw him standing in front of a tablet. When I walked up to him, I saw that all of his attention was on the tablet. I looked at the price tag and without a second thought flagged a worker and told him I wanted to buy one. My son looked at me, and for the first time, he was smiling at me. While I was purchasing the tablet, the man that was ringing me up said, "Man, this is the best tablet for the money. I bought one for my son and he has been learning so much from it now. I swear he's teaching me stuff I never knew." I chuckled and handed him my card. The entire car ride back, my son begged me to take the tablet out of the box, but I told him to wait until the morning. He huffed and sighed, but I could tell he was excited for the morning. After my son went to bed, I spent about the house setting up the tablet. It's one of those kid-safe tablets that allow the parents to restrict apps, amount of usage time, and websites. Once I was satisfied with the restrictions, I plugged the phone and tablet up and went to bed. I woke up the next morning to my son bouncing on my chest. Teasingly, I asked him, "What do you want?" He started to scream about the tablet, while I laughed and unplugged the tablet and handed it to him. With a squeal of delight, he ran out of my room. The distant sound from the clicking of the tablet made me smile while I fell asleep again. At 9:45, I woke back up again and walked out to the living room to see my son was working on a little puzzle on the tablet. The day went by smooth. When the 4-hour mark hit, my son's tablet locked up and he brought it to me. I told him that he would have to play with something else for 5 hours before he could play with the tablet again. I readied myself for a fit, but he just smiled and said, "Okay," before running off into his room. 3 hours later, I heard the sound of sirens coming from a distance and stopped close to my house. I peeked out of the house and saw 2 cops running into my neighbor's house. I opened the door and stepped out and saw my neighbor open the door and walk outside with his arms up. My son walked out the door and stood beside me. Before I could get him back inside the house, he said, "He screwed his dead wife. Did it after he bashed the skull with a hammer while she slept." I turned around and stared at him before asking, "You don't say stuff like that, Eric. Who taught you that?" With a smile, he looked up at me and asked, "Taught me what, Jared?" While I tried to think of what to say, he ran into the house and into his room. The entire time we ate dinner, I tried talking to him, but he would just look up at me and say, "Tablet," before resuming his meal. When he ate all that he wanted, he got off of his chair and went to his room. When I finished my dinner, I went up to his room and saw that he was already asleep. With a sigh, I walked in and took his socks off before tucking him in and giving him a kiss on his cheek. I plugged up his tablet and my phone and attempted to sleep, but I couldn't keep my eyes closed. The concern for my son overwhelmed me, and after several hours of tossing and turning, I got out of bed and went through the entire tablet. 2 hours later, I finally plugged the tablet back up to the charger and went back to bed. Yesterday morning, I woke up to the sound of voices coming from the living room. When I walked out to the living room, my son pointed to the TV and said, "Told you." Our local news channel was talking about what my neighbor did. He was convicted of murdering his wife and storing her body in his wine cellar. I felt the blood rush from my face while I turned the TV off. My son got off the couch and ran into my room. He came back out with his tablet and started messing around with a couple of games on it. I looked over his shoulder the entire time he was on the tablet. The only odd thing he did was clicking on the browser and stayed on the front page while staring at the screen with more fascination than the entire time he was on his tablet. He kept staring at it until the screen blacked out and went to the lock screen. Without a word, he handed the tablet back to me. But before he ran off, he looked up at me and said, "Grandma and Grandpa killed my mom. They poisoned her, but you were too stupid to know." I picked the tablet up and begged for it to tell me. When I unlocked the tablet, it just went to a black screen before white letters appeared on the screen. It said, "Stupid man." My son and I went back to Walmart to return the tablet, but they tried to process the refund and told me that the tablet was never on their system. I took the receipt out of my pocket and gave it to them, but the girl looked at me and said, "You need to leave." When I tried to reason with her, she just got madder and said, "I'm tired of people thinking they can say whatever they want to me just because I work here. My son loves me. He will always love me. Get lost, you piece of crap." She threw the receipt back at me. When I picked it up off the ground, I noticed that the receipt now only said one thing. "Just accept it. You're a sad excuse of a parent. Your son will never love you." After I put my son to bed, I tried sleeping, but every time I started to fall asleep, I would hear my wife's voice say, "You could have saved me, but you were just too foolish." Every time I looked up, I would see my son standing at the doorway. I woke up this morning after sleeping for just 2 hours. I don't know who to turn to. This is my last hope. Please, guys, help me. I'm scared, and for the first time in my life, I truly don't know what to do. Horror in real life doesn't come suddenly. It's not a shock or a reactionary scream. Horror in real life is a slow realization that occurs over the course of years. It needs time to mold, decay, and spread. True horror is painful, often sad and tragic. It's a slow deterioration, separating you from all forms of comfort and happiness. It is this kind of horror that I have felt ever since I learned of my mother's passing. The circumstances of her death did not make things any easier. It wasn't a slow death with time to make amends, adjust, or say goodbye. She hadn't been fighting a disease or infection for years. She wasn't old and nearing the end of her life. Her death came for her quickly and unexpected. My mother, who, after divorce, and my brother moving away, had been living alone. She kept herself busy by working for the church and caring for her parents. My last couple visits home, I had noticed she seemed more fragile than she should for a woman her age. She had lost weight and seemed starved for visitors. There was also a look in her eyes that bothered me. They were sleepless, panicked, and broken. It seemed as if she wanted to tell me something, but couldn't. Instead, she would just smile sadly and change the subject. I was told that my brother found her late one night in October, locked in the downstairs bathroom, naked, lying in her own blood, with her wrist sliced open. She was 63 years old. Knowing that suicide is a mortal sin in the Catholic Church, and my mother being a devout Catholic, I couldn't help but wonder if something else was involved in her passing. Not anything scandalous or plotted, but something queer and uncomfortable that had been with me and my thoughts since I was a child. It dealt with our family home, and more particularly, the old wooden doors. It all began with trouble sleeping. For as long as I can remember, I always had trouble falling asleep in my parents' house. My grandmother told me that as a small child, I was prone to sleep terrors. She would watch me during the day while my parents were at work, and in the evenings when they went out to dinner. She told me that she was watching me the night a bad storm hit our neighborhood. A tornado had been spotted that night, but never touched down. However, the lightning did claim the house's electricity. My grandmother raced to my bedroom, worried the window facing my crib would break under the violent wind. There was something else she was afraid of as well. When my grandmother picked me up from my crib, she said she felt something in the room. Something new, different, and dark. My grandmother, who came to America from Italy as a child, told my parents that she had felt a strange presence that night and begged them to allow her to do a prayer to remove the Maloik, an old world superstition. But my parents, who were religious, believed in angels and demons, not folklore. They didn't want to dabble in curses and superstition. As I got older, the sleep terrors continued as nightmares. It wasn't uncommon for me to wake up hours after going to bed, only to be too afraid to fall back asleep. Later in high school, I dealt with my insomnia by not sleeping for days until I could fall asleep quickly. It wasn't until I went away for college that I was able to rest peacefully. I attribute my difficulty sleeping all of those years to the doors in my parents' house. They were big, plain wood doors, simple, with no additional furnishings or decoration. They seemed ominous, nevertheless. I would spend hours looking at the patterns in the grain, finding shapes and images in them, like one would do with clouds. The more I looked, the more I saw, until the images seemed so clear to me. Strange, famished figures, naked with one leg or half a torso, rabid dogs, an old bearded man. I saw faces too, wide-eyed, mouths open, sometimes made of knots in the wood, all suffering as if the spirit of these things had somehow become trapped in the wood. The bathroom door on the first floor was the worst. It was positioned next to the door leading to the basement, and the lock on the doorknob was finicky. It would sometimes get stuck or give way, locking or unlocking by itself. The bathroom door also had one of the strangest designs. In the center of the door, there was what looked like a woman in intense pain, as if she was in labor. Her face was contorted and blurred with vertical lines of grain. Tearing its way out of what I could only imagine as a stomach in my childlike imagination was a wide-eyed creature. I would see the bathroom door in my dreams as well. I had terrible nightmares where I was floating and desperately trying to get away from the bathroom, but I was being pulled backwards by an invisible force, unable to escape. It would suck me into the darkness of the room. The door would slam shut and lock before I would have a chance to wake up, panicked and out of breath. The nightmares and the lack of sleep only made my already active imagination worse. The strange images in the door weighed on me. There was a door for every room in the house. I could not escape them. They were a constant presence, staring out at me from the wooden veneers. As a child, I began to see other things. Things that found a way out of the trappings of the wooden frame. Not things I could look at directly, but rather things that appeared in my peripheral vision. The kinds of things that always begged to be questioned. Was someone there, or was my imagination getting the best of me? Over time, I got better at being watchful and looking out without shifting my gaze. One night, when I was 6 years old, I went into my parents' bedroom, feeling guilty that I wasn't yet asleep. I needed to be reassured and comforted because I had scared myself badly. My mother gave me a hug and asked me what was wrong. I told her that I see things out of the corner of my eyes. She asked me about their appearance, but I couldn't get a good look at them. As soon as I turned my head, they were gone. She asked me when the last time was that I had seen one. I told her that there is one with us right now in the corner of the room. My mother looked over at what to her was an empty corner in a room. She told me that maybe there were angels sent by God to watch and protect me. But they weren't. Something in the pit of my stomach would turn, and I would feel sick around them. They were motionless beings, staring blankly at me, only moving when I wasn't looking, slowly getting closer to me every time I looked away. I'd first discovered them in my peripheral vision outside my bedroom on the stairs late at night when I couldn't sleep. I would notice a dark shape peeking over the top stair, eyes glistening where nothing should be. I would try to quickly shift my gaze to refocus on them, but they were always gone. I'd eventually look away and then find them again at my bedroom door, and then even closer at my desk, ever present just outside of sight. I decided that they must be demons, not the red-horned demons from cartoons, but something else. They seemed old, as if they were somehow misplaced, out of time. At night, when I would see them, I would be too afraid to move or do anything but stare blankly, not giving them a chance to move in closer. Sometimes I would hear them talk to me in my head. They would tell me to do things like wait in the corner of the room or flood my mind with images of strange, exotic places. I would sometimes do what they said, though nothing ever came of it. My mother panicked one afternoon when she couldn't find me. She searched the entire house, eventually finding me in the bedroom closet facing the wall, where the voices had told me to wait. She was in tears when I told her about the voices. She bought me a rosary and asked if the demons were the reason I was having trouble sleeping. Eventually, my father blessed the house with holy water, room by room, as part of the celebration of the Epiphany, recommended every year by the church. It was after this, when I was still seeing them, that my mother became bothered by the demons and their doors. It began to weigh on her as well. I grew up in a suburb just outside of Cleveland in a working-class neighborhood predominantly made up of Irish, Italians, Slovenians, where religion was very much a part of life. My parents were passionately involved in the church as well, and it was through them that I learned to take the sightings I was having very seriously. Instead of denouncing my demons as part of my imagination, my fears were reinforced and their existence confirmed through the power of faith and community. One night, we had a priest who was new to the parish over to our house to meet the family. After dinner, he asked me if there was anything I wanted to ask God for. I told him that there are demons in this house that hide in the doors, and I wanted them to go away. My parents shared a look of concern as my mother tried to explain. The priest looked at the doors before he left and assured me everything was okay. Later that evening, he spoke with my parents and something was settled between adults. A couple of months later, my father did a small home renovation, which included replacing all of the doors with white ones. It was relieving for the doors to finally be gone, and I thought I would now be rid of the strange creatures and be able to sleep. But it was too late. My mother told me that she was having the nightmares now as well. Something about the doors, she would say. As I got older, I read about the possession of objects like the Annabelle doll, and how the Native Americans believed in evil wood spirits called Wakakuna. But I mostly ignored the demons, and I eventually stopped seeing them. Despite my mother's wishes, I no longer went to church and I refused to talk about religious matters or anything involving the strange things I had seen and felt in the house. I told myself that the horrors I faced as a child were due to my overactive imagination and strict religious upbringing. By the time I left for college, there had been no talk of doors, demons, or nightmares for a long time, although I would still occasionally get that sick feeling in my stomach late at night when I was near the downstairs bathroom door. My parents would later divorce, my mum keeping the house and working at the church. I moved away for work to Twin Falls. It wasn't until my dad called to tell me about the circumstances of my mother's passing that I began to wonder if something more had happened to my mother. I made the trip home to find that my childhood neighborhood had been hit hard by the recession. It was now only a faded memory of the town I grew up in. The corner ice cream parlor was now a get cash fast lender, and the streets were relatively empty and bleak. Houses were boarded up, and my old high school had closed. Parked at a red light, I watched the traffic lights signal to empty streets. My parents' house even looked different, old, and not as well kept as it was when my father had lived there. The grass had been overrun with weeds and the siding was dirty. We stood in front of the house that afternoon after the funeral, my brothers, father and I. My brothers explained to me how my mom had been stressed, her mood swings had been violent, and her sleeping pattern was erratic. she would go for long periods of time without sleeping, and then fall into a deep sleep for days. My brother told me how late one evening, after work, he had gone over our mother's house to check on her. It had been 2 or 3 in the morning by the time he had arrived and let himself in, finding our mother in the kitchen making breakfast. He told me she had been confused about the time and had thought that it was morning. He explained that she was trying different medications to help with the insomnia, and the doctors had thought the mood swings and suicide could have been a side effect. I told them about how I used to have trouble sleeping in a house and about the demons and the doors. They laughed. They were too young to remember. I told them that I thought I was going to sleep better after Dad had replaced the doors, but it wasn't until college that I slept well. My dad stopped me and told me that he never replaced the doors. He had just painted them white. Here's a story from my early childhood. As a kid, I had trouble sleeping because I was immensely afraid of the dark, and anything even pertaining to any sort of monster or villain would keep me up all night. My older brothers loved tormenting me to drive me up the walls, and it worked, although I never would have admitted it. My mom, the caring mother that she was ultimately worried about my health. She was a doctor and always preached that sleeping at least 8 hours a day was a key to a good life. So, ignoring my pleas, she told me that she was going to buy a baby monitor, whether I want it or not, to check on me during the night. My brothers thought this was hilarious, but I ignored them and went to bed one night with a baby monitor lying on the nightstand next to me. Later through the night, my eyelids began to drop, and I was about to doze off when the monitor crackled to life, and the only thing I heard was crickets. I was caught a little off guard at that point. Crickets? They certainly sounded like crickets, but I wasn't sure. Soon enough, another sound joined the supposed sound of the insects. It sounded remarkably similar to footsteps crunching through leaves. Then there was a lot of shoving around like someone dropped the monitor, and then dead silence. I shook the baby monitor, assuming it was broken. "Hello?" I said. More silence. Then more moving around from the other end. No more crickets, no more footsteps. "Hello, Mom?" I repeated once again. I heard a deep breath come from the other line. Then it started humming what seemed like a lullaby, and a smile broke out on my face because Mom used to hum this to me when I was little. I instantly knew it was her. I let her hum a little more, then yawned and said, "Good night, Mom. I love you." The humming stopped immediately. Silence. "I love you too," she finally responded. The next morning I woke up and was actually surprised that I hadn't been eaten or torn to shreds by some vile creature. I ran downstairs and hugged Mom, who was caught off guard and then laughed. "What is it, Chris?" she said, rubbing her hand through my hair. "It really helped, Mom, thank you." She smiled down at me, ruffled my hair, then broke free from my hug. "What helped, hon?" she asked, stepping back to make breakfast. I was a little confused, but then figured it was some sort of trick question. "You're humming! You hummed to me last night," I said, hopping from foot to foot, grinning like I had just won a prize. Mom turned to me, her smile gone, a look of concern on her face. "Christopher, I didn't hum to you last night. You must have been so tired you were hallucinating," she said, getting down on her knees and staring into my eyes, which were bloodshot for the first time in about a month. I rocked back and forth on my heels, scratching my favourite footy pyjamas. "You hummed to me through the baby monitor," I said, getting a little impatient. "You're lying. Lying isn't good." Mom pursed her lips, like she was in deep thought. "Baby monitor?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, nodding. Mom got up and pulled out some dishes out of a drawer. "How about you go up and bring the baby monitor down for me to see, okay? That's your mission. Imagine you're a spy." When I heard the part about being a spy, I took off right away. I bolted up the stairs and was running down the carpet-floored hallway when I was stopped by John, the third oldest brother. Of course, he taunted me before letting me go, where I then got pushed down by my second oldest brother, who was coming from the direction of my room. "Hey twerp," he said, stepping on my right hand and briskly walking down the hallway. "Stop doing that, Samuel," I called after him, pushing myself up and darting into my room. I ran over to the nightstand, but the baby monitor was gone. Of course, I had to explain this to my mom, and she thought I wasn't getting enough sleep and told herself that she'd be getting me a real baby monitor very soon. That night, I walked into my bedroom and found a plastic, dusty-looking baby monitor that had various strange stains on it. There were grubby pictures of little baby ducks and flowers on it as well. I honestly thought that this was a piece of junk, and I would have been genuinely surprised if it even worked. I figured Mum had just dragged this out of a flea market somewhere while I was at baseball practice, and slipped in the batches to it that were lying on the floor, thinking they had rolled off the nightstand. It took a while, but after listening to deafening static coming from its speaker for quite some time, I could hear deep breathing, like Mom had just ran a mile and was holding the monitor up to her mouth. I crawled in bed, and the breathing continued until I fell asleep. The next morning, I got up and ate breakfast, but I didn't mention a word to my mom about the monitor, not wanting to risk the chance of looking dumb in front of her again because, truthfully, at that age, I had a low self-esteem. I played at my friend's house that day, and when I got home, I had dinner and was pretty tired from exploring with my friend. I went up to my bed and crashed there pretty quick around 6:30. I was awoken by the sound of static coming through the baby monitor deep in the middle of the night, probably around 1 in the morning. I turned towards the nightstand and stared at the baby monitor, waiting for it to calm down and become legible. When the static cleared, all I heard was crickets once again. I was utterly confused why Mum would be outside at this hour. I leaned in toward the monitor. "Mom?" I asked. To this day, I will never forget the feeling, the despair that went through me as I heard, faintly, the sound of my own voice coming through the other end. My heart stopped, and I stared at the monitor for the longest amount of time. I was frozen, paralyzed. My attention was finally diverted away from the monitor when I heard grass crunching outside my window. I threw the covers off of myself, jumped out of bed, and ran towards the bedroom door. As I reached for the doorknob, I saw an image that is still burned into my mind. The shadow of a man peering through my window, clutching a baby monitor in one hand, silhouetted against the bright moon, was projecting against my bedroom door. I screamed, throwing the door open, running as fast as I could down the hallway. I heard the man running outside, trying to catch up to me. I sprinted into my mom's bedroom, jumped on the bed, waking her up. Tears spilled down my face as I explained everything, and as I did so, she reached for the phone. She dialed 911, and the police arrived shortly after. They searched the house and yard, and even looked for him all around the town and the state, but could never find him. I've kept this story to myself for quite some time now. This all happened when I was 5. I'm 16 now, and every one of my brothers has moved out except John, who's 18 and going to college soon. I sleep soundly most of the time, but recently, I've been kept up through part of the night by my brother, who seems to be having conversations with someone in the dark. Jeremy Miller was never a man of God. Whereas all the other kids he grew up with spent their Sundays in their respective holy houses, Jeremy spent his Sunday mornings glued to the television. He grew on the knowledge of the Discovery Channel, the girth of the internet, and the pages of his textbooks. He used them to write his own story of creation. It was a story of evolution, probability, and string theory. He saw an enormity to the universe, and to the realities and dimensions beyond it. He knew he was small, but he knew that no matter how big and unbelievable the world got, everything could be explained. He was always certain. Jeremy was never a believer. He went on to Caltech to pursue a career in biological engineering, just as he had planned since he was 7 years old. His parents were proud and amazed. They said they'd been blessed to have such a smart son. Jeremy scoffed at the notion. To Jeremy, it had been as natural as the world around him. It was all a product of his will and his actions. Alone, he could do anything. Now that was a miracle. Jeremy didn't believe in ghosts. The old house, 25 Plumer Hill Road, struck him as perfectly quaint. The New Hampshire woods always piqued his interest, partly for their ecological beauty, partly for their peace and quiet. That old house had buried itself within them. Jeremy wanted the same, but he also felt it was a great shame that the home's beauty had been hidden from the world. The steep, sloped architecture of the roof was picturesque. The stonework on the outside had an aged, yet majestic feel. The gardens outside, long since neglected, housed much potential. When flowered, they'd wrap around that house like a stunning knitted scarf. He saw it all in his mind, and it was magnificent. So he made it his. Now, he was told on numerous occasions about the home's darker nature. They told him that homes that hold such unpleasant histories tend to hold a bit of that energy forever. They told him it makes their spiritual foundation weak. All he heard was price reduction. Jeremy took it without hesitation. "It is perfect," he said, smiling. For a while, Jeremy was content. He was finally home. He almost resented the day and his job for stealing him away from that home. He enjoyed his career, and he was excited to see what he could do for the world. But the house? Well, that house was his sick child, and he took great pleasure in nursing it back to health. All evenings and most mornings, he put countless hours of work into the place. He had to replace many of the windows and recaulk their frames. The living room was quite dreadful, as the ceiling above had seen some awful neglect. He had to add a crossbeam for support and completely redo the floor of the guest bedroom above. Then, of course, he tended to the gardens. There was only so much he could do about it midwinter, but he did all he could to prep it. Come spring, he'd be ready. It would be perfect. However, as the renovations went on throughout his home, Jeremy started to notice some peculiar happenings. During his remodeling of the first floor bathroom, Jeremy believed that he had heard footsteps in the hallway above him. Investigating, he found that, of course, he was alone. The prospect of an intruder did come to mind. He was very jumpy and concerned in that regard. The house was large for just one person, and someone could easily hide in near plain sight. He slept unwell that night, but after 2 days of silence and thorough inspection, he concluded that it had been his imagination. It usually was. However, when the sounds of footsteps continued, and then eventually evolved into sounds of actual conversation, Jeremy became concerned. No longer was it a simple glitch in his mind, an exaggeration of a thought. This was real. Someone was inside his home. It became particularly frustrating when neither Jeremy nor the authorities could find any trace of an unwanted guest. As far as they could tell, Jeremy was the only one who'd set foot in there for some time. That left Jeremy pondering irrational thoughts. He thought about ghosts. Don't be ridiculous. There was absolutely no such thing. Spirits? Silly, childish attempts to bring understanding to the abstract that was death. They were made for comfort, inventions for occurrences without explanation. Ghosts were life's absolution, its deus ex machina excuse. Fiction, Jeremy was certain. Then, Jeremy saw the girl. She was young, probably about 8 years old. She wore a teal flower dress with frills around the edges. At first, it was his eyes playing tricks. Then, it was simply his deceitful mind. The third time, he had no excuse. The appearances became frequent and impossible to dismiss. He saw the girl in the hallway of the first floor. Coming home from work, he saw her peering out across the land from between the bathroom curtains on the second floor. She'd run by the bedroom door at 2 a.m. on a particularly sleepless night. Her appearances would have been less striking had the house's morbid history not been explained to him in gruesome detail. No young girl had been in that home for quite some time. Jeremy was convinced that there was still no little girl in that home. Yet, every day and night, she was there. Without giving in to the paranormal rubbish, Jeremy had no explanation for why he could see her, the murdered child. Jeremy could only hold out for so long. One night, Jeremy had decided he'd had enough. Footsteps had once more disturbed his relatively peaceful mind before his sleep. Sleep and a restful mind were both in short supply those days. Again, the footsteps came. She was running again, excitedly running. The sound of the girl's feet echoed in his skull as she ran from room to room. He couldn't understand why or how, but at the moment, he didn't care. He wanted it to stop. Jeremy made a stand. Any fear he had was swallowed by his frustration and rage. He hesitated, but the entity, though he didn't dare consider it as such, hadn't harmed him yet. It was still possible that the mirage of the girl was still just a construction of his mind. It was quite possible he was in no danger at all. He couldn't convince himself of that. He was no longer certain. He gripped the doorknob anyway. Throwing the bedroom door open, he roared at her. She was there, at the end of the darkened hallway. Jeremy barely saw her face through the shadows, yet he saw enough to know that his outrage barely caused her to hesitate. He cursed at her and ordered her to keep still. Silence fell after a few seconds, and she responded. Every word came paired with one single footstep forward. "Mister?" she asked innocently. "I can't find my mommy. Can you help me?" The space between every word hit him harder than the words themselves. It was a terrible, awful silence. Regret swelled in his stomach. It tugged at his arm, trying to force the door shut. He refused it. Jeremy would rather stare it down and give in to his baser instincts. It couldn't possibly be her. There was no girl. "Go away," Jeremy ordered. "Please," she smiled. "Please help me." She was almost upon him, and the air around him drew heat from his body like a vampire drawing blood. The thing, the illusion, the hallucination before him got within an arm's distance from him. He was close enough to touch her, and that frightened him. What would happen if he was wrong? "Stop it," Jeremy instructed. He hoped that saying it would work, and his mind would stop. She remained. She looked like she'd been painted onto the air. Real, but not entirely there. Real enough that he could reach out and touch her if he had chosen to. He had to know. His right hand extended towards her, wary. She mirrored the gesture, reaching for him. Their fingers got so close, but the feeling Jeremy expected never came. Instead of the silky warmth of another person, or anything solid at all he received was a bite like a January breeze. Her fingers slipped through his palms, and then they appeared again on the other side. Jeremy held his breath, his hand shaking fiercely. It had been so long since anything had surprised him. She whispered, her face suddenly sullen. "I think he's still here." There was a warmth that soaked into Jeremy's naked feet. Blood. Blood had flowed across the hardwood floors and swirled beneath his toes. His eyes followed the path of the river to the girl and up her legs to her dress. He found its source. As clear as day, he saw 2 spots soaked in blood, with 2 clean tears in her dress. 2 stab wounds that still bled fresh pain. Out of the darkness, a rapid emergence startled him. Behind the girl, where previously only the blackness had loomed, a face appeared. A man, twice the girl's height, including the black top hat upon his head, stared at Jeremy with wide, black eyes. The eyes were encircled with red. They oozed with warmth and dampness. It looked as though all the skin from his nose and cheeks up to his hat had been peeled away, torn away. The only flesh left was around his mouth, and it had arched itself into an awful smile. It peeled back over filed, pointed teeth. "Do you believe yet?" it asked, hissing. Jeremy's arm moved out of instinct to shut himself away from the horrors. An involuntary scream erupted from his mouth as he collapsed against the door. His horrified sounds drowned out the soft laughter on the other side of the door. Jeremy spent all his night there, wondering if they did the same. He thought he could almost feel a moist wind upon the nape of his neck. For the first time since he was a child, Jeremy cried. They had told him about her, of course. Before it had been such a trivial detail, but now he couldn't stop thinking about it. A girl had been murdered here, by her own father nonetheless. She'd been stabbed, strangled, and a body had been discovered in the attic by her mother. Everybody's favourite part of the story was the singular fact that her father had escaped, never captured. They loved wondering what happened to him. The murder had occurred half a century ago, and everyone was still morbidly fond of it. It gave them something to talk about over their campfires. It gave all the teenagers a good hoot. Jeremy had often seen them passing by, their eyes open in awe as they were told he was living their dream. He was the only one living in the haunted house. No, he refused to believe it. His eyes had lied to him. There was no such thing. He was a scientist. His reasoning was in numbers, papers, statistics, and graphs. This meant nothing. It took a week for him to calm his nerves and a single thought. He had pondered selling the house. He decided that was the final straw. Never, not for any demon or ghoul or Satan himself, would he abandon that beautiful home. His first home. He would not run like some frightened schoolboy. He was never a man of God, but he was a man of faith. His faith was in what he knew and what he could prove. So he studied the case of the little girl. For a while, this proved more of a detriment than an aid. The girl he'd seen in the hallway surely was the girl who'd been murdered there. The likeness he observed in the pictures he found was indeed the girl he'd seen. That meant that it would have been impossible for his mind to create the illusions he'd seen previously. She was real, in some sense of the word. Their presence had to have an explanation, however. Something had been there that night. Something had physically chilled him. He'd felt the thing's blood on his feet. So he pondered. He nearly gave in to their ruse. Then, like the great Sherlock Holmes himself, he realized something. He looked back, and indeed his suspicions were correct. There was a flaw. There was one little detail that gave him hope. The flaw was so minor that had he not been actively searching for it, he never would have seen it. It was unlikely to be mentioned by anyone, and therefore it was easy to overlook. However, it was not necessary if one was simply pretending. He knew for sure that they weren't ghosts. He just wanted answers. They came back again that night, for the last time, in the attic. Jeremy heard them talking above his head, whispered voices. He climbed the ladder, and he pulled himself into the dark attic. He fumbled around, looking for the switch. The attic felt so empty, so quiet. When the lights came on, he saw that he wasn't alone. The two dangling light bulbs above revealed so little in that cramped attic, but they showed enough. She stood far from Jeremy, just beyond the reach of the furthest bulb. Jeremy took his spot under the other. He found comfort in its light. With both performers in their places, Jeremy recited his lines. "Who are you?" Jeremy asked. His voice wavered just a bit. Most of his fear was restrained inside. "Sally," the girl spoke, going through the motions. "Sally Johnson. I'm 8 years old, and can you—" "You were stabbed, weren't you?" Jeremy interrupted. Sally nodded. "By a very bad man." On cue, Jeremy felt the man in the top hat behind him. He didn't need to imagine the man's breath this time, but it made him smile. Why does a ghost need to breathe? "He stabbed you?" Jeremy asked again for clarification. "Twice?" Sally, or whatever she was, nodded in sorrowful agreement. That's when Jeremy smiled. He had her. "Try again," Jeremy said. pulling a newspaper article from his pocket. "This says you were stabbed 3 times in the chest. You're missing a stab wound. Right side, first intercostal." Sally looked downwards at her dress. It remained intact and unsullied by her collarbone. That changed in a heartbeat as she corrected the flaw. Her dress and flesh tore without a sound. Blood poured from the wound and soaked her dress in moments. Not a single drop dripped onto the ground. Even then, the 2 wounds you had before were mirror images. They were on the wrong side of your body. She was stabbed below the heart both times, 4th intercostal. Your cut is on your right side, and it's in the 3rd. Sally didn't speak. The dead girl was silent. "You're not ghosts," Jeremy said, feeling very clever. "You're just pretending to be." "Yes," Sally admitted. "You're right." Even though he knew the man was there, Jeremy jumped a bit as the man walked around beside him. The man was dressed in a rugged tuxedo. His left hand, gloved in white, gripped his lapel, whilst his other gloved hand held a black cane firmly. It clicked and clacked as he strolled by Jeremy. Every laboured breath he took hissed through his blooded nostrils. He was smiling, smugly. "Why are you here?" Jeremy asked, to no reply. The man had reached the girl, and they shared some muffled words. She nodded in response to what was seemingly a question, and the man in the tuxedo chuckled. They shook hands, and he turned to take his place at her side. A pleased smile shone across his face. "Please?" Jeremy said. His tone, almost pleading, drew their attention. "Please?" Sally asked. "I need to know." Sally chuckled as she looked at him. "My boy, you'll find out rather soon," said the faceless gentleman. "I need to know," Jeremy snapped. He was tired of the dark. "I deserve to know." "You deserve nothing," the girl said, like a parent to a petulant child. "You will get nothing." "Now," the man stated in a suave tone, "I believe the poor thing deserves a little. It can do no harm. Besides..." His sentence trailed off as he leaned down to whisper in Sally's ear. Jeremy couldn't hear a single syllable, but whatever that man uttered in her ear caused the young girl to tremble. She nodded in agreement. Sally obliged to Jeremy's request. "I'm just looking, dear," she said with a smile. "Looking?" Jeremy said, confused by her response. "Yes, shopping might be more appropriate, I suppose. That's what you would call it, and I believe we've just closed a deal." To this, the man in the hat literally grinned from ear to ear. His mouth ripped across his face, seeming to tear muscle and sinew to make way for his devilish smile. A chuckle escaped his toothy maw as he took the young girl's hand and offered a firm handshake. The deal was done. "Pity," she continued. "I know how many were looking at this place. So many. Too bad. They had their chance." At that, the man in the hat bowed. He bent down low behind the girl, into the shadows. He didn't come back up. "I do enjoy this place," Sally said, clasping her hand behind her back. "The pain is so fresh." "My house?" Jeremy asked. "No," Sally said with a chuckle. "All of it." There was a flicker of the lights, and Jeremy thought he felt the house quiver. "Why, Sally?" he asked of the thing. "Teach me." "When you stab something here," she began, licking her lips, "you damage it irreparably, right? There'll be a scar. That scar is a weak point. This house, the events here." Before Jeremy's eyes, the scene changed. In the end of the attic where Sally had been standing, he saw her on the ground. Sally, the apparition, was on the ground, and she was gasping her final breaths. The thing was showing her dying moments. Then, behind her, a shadow emerged. It seemed to seep upwards out of Sally's body, out of her wounds. The clouds leaped and swirled above her now still body. Sally's voice, or whatever had been pretending to be her, spoke again. "Scars show. They show to us, the ones who can see, and we crawl through them. We crawl through the pain." The shadow stirred, and out of it came a clawed hand that gripped the young girl's corpse by the throat. The memory of that event, the scar tissue, gives us all we need to blend in. We wear the memories like clothes. Your superstitious nature does the rest. The shadow pulled, and Jeremy had to look away as it pulled the skin from Sally's body, like a tablecloth from the table. He couldn't bring himself to watch as the shadowed thing crawled from the smoke and filled itself into the empty husk that was once Sally. What was left was a pale imitation, a spectre. It spoke through a twisted mouth that hung too loose on its head. "It's not always perfect, as you pointed out," it spoke, the skin and mouth slowly coming back into form. "Memories are blurry and fleeting. There are always flaws, but they are superficial. Who will care? It's always the non-believers versus the fools. Always so willing to label what you don't understand. You made it too easy." The lights flickered again and again. The thing that was pretending to be Sally stepped forward. Jeremy started to back away. Jeremy started to think. She let him speak. "It's camouflage." She nodded. "It worked here. It worked everywhere. You are always so clueless." "No," Jeremy said, concerned. "Not me. I wasn't." "You got close." The house trembled and the roof shook as if barraged by a fierce hailstorm. The noise and shaking escalated until it felt like the roof would give in and the house would fall. Jeremy fell to his back, almost straight down the ladder that led to the attic. "What is that?" he asked. "I leaked in through the scar," she said, smiling, "like a virus. Now we're opening it." She was right above him, and as the noise reached its climax, Jeremy asked his final question. "Who are you?" The silence that followed gripped his throat. She leaned down. It felt like a dream as she whispered in his ear, "I'm the new tenant." With that, there was a blinding light from the back of the attic. Pieces of wood peeled away, strip by strip, and those strips in turn peeled into fibers. From them peeled the paint and the nails, and they ignited into flames. Every piece burned away, but no ash was left in their wake. No, it was as if their burning tore through the air and revealed something new behind it. As the entire back wall burned, Jeremy looked through the hole in space, the open scar. Another world lay before him. The fire had painted a ghastly image. A world of nightmares. Plains and hills of scarlet grass lay as far as the eye could see. Beyond it, more fire rings, like the one that had engulfed his house, raged. They all pulsated and cracked as giant clawed hands tended to them and molded them like they were clay on a pottery wheel. It was impossible. In the distance, rings taller than skyscrapers roared. They looked large enough to swallow whole cities. Through them, worlds scorned by fire and blood lay ravaged. Cries and screams echoed on the wind like bird calls. By each ring stood a man in a top hat. As the ring grew round him, held open by a giant, insectoid pair of forceps, Jeremy saw whole worlds come into view. They fell through the rings, and the red plains absorbed them. The ground came alive, and it gripped the worlds with earthen tendrils and spines. They reached through the fiery portals and ensnared everything in their path. Every world, every universe beyond it, was strangled into submission. What happened next, Jeremy could only dread. The men in the top hats looked on in joy as thousands perished beneath the living ground. Around them, creatures indescribable gathered and bartered. They all fought for the chance to see. The men in hats smiled and showed the lucky ones through. Unopened scars were everywhere. They were the purveyors of worlds, of universes, and business was good. Jeremy knew then who the girl was. As the wind from that terrifying world coursed in, and the house succumbed to its flame, the thing that had worn Sally's visage, her memory, smiled and basked. Powered by her native land, her body formed corporeal, and her ethereal disguise was shed. The skin sagged from her face and hands, and from within her mouth protruded spider-like limbs. Those legs proceeded to pull free her skull from the clutches of her mandible and neck. As the monster reformed its ghastly exoskeleton before Jeremy, he could only chuckle. As the visitor in his room had been, so had all the other ghosts been before. They weren't lost spirits. They were disguised wanderers. They were just looking. Sally was different in only one regard. Sally decided to buy. Not him, not his soul, not his home, his reality. Everywhere else, surely the other scars would be open as well. He belonged to her now. As his world fell into the moor to become part of the one below, Jeremy knew he was right. There was no such thing as ghosts. Hey X, I need some advice. I know this isn't technically paranormal, but it's creepy as hell and I'm not sure what to do. I go to college in the northwestern United States, and a few weeks ago, during a party I was at, I stole a laptop and an iPod. I don't need to hear about how bad a person I am for stealing. Yeah, I know, and that's not going to help me now. I've occasionally stolen technology in the past to sell at pawn shops and stuff. I'm pretty good with computers, so I can usually circumvent their passwords and stuff, and sell them as if they were my own. Anyway, the computer I stole had some messed up stuff on it. Like some stuff that makes me think I stole from an actually violent and crazy person. I don't want to be too specific in case they or someone they know is on here. I'm pretty nervous about the whole thing. But my question is, does anyone know how to break into a TrueCrypt file? Is it even possible? There is one on here, and I'm not even sure if I want to know what's on there after the crazy stuff I found that wasn't even password protected. I usually go through the computer first before deleting anything. It's kind of exciting for me. It's like spying on someone's life. I can see all their pictures and check through their browsing history. Sometimes there are even saved passwords on their computer for their Facebook and stuff, so I can check through all that. I never mess with their Facebook or anything. I just scope out their life. It's pretty exciting though, to kind of rummage through a person's life. but the videos I found on this computer, I have never seen anything like that before, even on crazy places like Motherless or Deep Web. They are obviously real though. I kind of feel like I ought to go to the police, but I don't know how to explain how I came to be in possession of the computer, and I definitely don't want this guy knowing I stole his computer and then turning him into the police. I can't really even make an anonymous tip because the house I was at was a friend of a friend. Obviously I don't steal from people I know well. A ways away from campus, and I don't remember exactly where it was. And the computer doesn't have a name. Like how computers usually have recovery/registration info and account names and stuff. Yeah, I guess there's no chance of him seeing it here or tracing it back to me. And he obviously knows someone stole his computer, but there were a bunch of people there that night. But no, I'm definitely not going to put the videos up, or talking about the videos in specifics. I just want to know if there's any way I can see the encrypted files. There were lots of people there, but the room was like in the basement under the stairs. People were down in the basement smoking weed at one point, but it was pretty much empty after that. So later, when we were about to go, I went down there to go pee, and just went down in his room real quick and threw the laptop and iPod in my backpack. Then we left the party soon after. Pretty normal room, although he did have a big Bowie knife sitting on his windowsill. The computer had all the normal 4chan stuff, lots of gore and porn. No reaction pictures or GIFs though, I noticed. Fairly normal computer history. I mean, still had some gory stuff, but that's pretty normal these days. Add Eraser and CC Cleaner and TrueCrypt and stuff. But again, that's pretty normal for anyone who explores the internet a lot and would rather be careful. But then I found the really screwed up videos. There are like 3 self-injury videos, I think, and one where he even kills a dog. And none of these were password protected. He has a TrueCrypt, and he didn't even bother to put these in there. That's what makes me really nervous. Just what the hell did he bother to encrypt? And no, you never see his face in any of the videos. No, the dog is like drugged or something because it's sort of lying there and tries to get up a few times. Then he goes and puts this metal thing between its teeth so it can't close its mouth, and cuts out its tongue. While he's doing this, the dog starts to roll around and squeal, so he puts the camera down while he holds the dog down and cuts out its tongue. Then he picks up the camera again and holds down its legs with his foot while he chops off its feet with a machete. The dog starts like this puking scream thing after 3 of its feet are gone. Then finally he flips it over on its back and guts it. He puts the camera down during this part too, then picks it up and watches until the dog dies. It's disgusting. I literally had to throw up after I watched it. It's like a golden retriever looking thing. It's 12.5 minutes long, and yeah, the guy in it is pretty built. In the other ones, it's a guy putting cigarettes out on his inner thigh, nailing his ballsack to a piece of wood, like a table or something, and sewing his thigh up. He's stabbing this big needle into one side of his skin, then the other, and pulls his skin tight to make kind of a crisscrossing pouch. All 3 look like they hurt like hell. In the one where he nails down his balls, he sounds like he's having an orgasm. The whole time he's pounding the nail, he's just moaning. Then he pulls back on his balls and stretches them out on the nail before he yanks the nail out. In the other 2, you only kind of hear him hissing. Pretty sure the guy in all the videos is the same. Well, it sounds like I probably can't get into the encrypted videos myself, so I guess I'm just going to wipe what I can from the computer, take it apart, and throw it away. Normally I would sell it, but this guy is way too messed up to play around with. I wouldn't want it somehow traced back to me. I probably don't want to know what was on the other videos anyway. I just kind of feel like I have to know now that I have already seen all this other stuff. Either way, this guy is really nuts, and should probably be in a mental institution or something, but is still just walking around. Honestly, this whole thing has really messed me up. I was so physically sick and paranoid the first night I saw them. I've been freaking out that this guy was gonna come after me or something, and it's just screwed up in general, that people like this exist, and not just in creepy backwoods, but in our liberal northwest United States. I feel like I'm now always going to be less able to trust people after this. I wish I'd never stolen the computer and seen the messed up stuff. You're probably gonna call me a pussy, but seeing something on the internet that you know lots of other people have seen that's probably fake anyway is way different than seeing really crazy graphic stuff that you can't tell anyone about, and knowing someone crazy now hates you and would probably kill you if they found out. I really think that's what's in the True Crypt videos. What else would this guy bother to encrypt? Fallout 3 contains several in-game radio stations. The most diverse and important station is Galaxy News Radio. Many players of the evil persuasion know that if you kill Three Dog, he will be replaced by the technician Margaret. She is not a charismatic person and has very little to say, seeming to not enjoy her new announcing duties. She also never appears in person, and therefore cannot be killed. Once Three Dog is dead, you're stuck with Margaret. What most players do not know is that under certain circumstances, GNR will become a number station. A number station is a station that broadcasts an unusual coded message. Many of these exist in real life, and some people hypothesize that they are a nuclear retaliation control network. Simply check Wikipedia for more information about these odd broadcasts as they relate to the real world. Back to Fallout 3. No one is really sure which actions are needed to hear the number station in Fallout 3. It appears that you must kill Three Dog, because no one has ever reported hearing the number station with him still alive. It also appears that you have to skip over the quest Galaxy News Radio, where you help boost the signal so that the station can be broadcast further than just the immediate DC area. This is easy enough to do with either a speech check or simply using the Fallout wiki to look up where to go next and advance the main plot. Finally, you definitely have to destroy Raven Rock. This is the actual trigger to turn GNR into a number station, and it will remain such for the rest of the game. However, the vast majority of players who perform these three actions still continue hearing the standard GNR broadcasts, so there must be several more requirements the community has yet to isolate. If you're lucky enough to have hit upon the right set of circumstances, just after destroying Raven Rock, you will get the message, "Radio signal lost," and a few seconds later, "Radio signal found." You cannot, however, actually listen to GNR just yet because you didn't boost the signal and are out of the range of the broadcast at the exit of Raven Rock. Luckily, Raven Rock is situated in the mountains, and it is right near one of the few places outside DC that you can get high enough to catch the signal. So far, the confirmed locations to hear GNR numbers signal are within the immediate DC area, obviously. This is true for the regular GNR throughout the game. At the top of the Ferris wheel at Point Lookout. On top of some of the SATCOM arrays you can climb in the northwestern map area. On the roof of Tenpenny Tower, though this may be within normal broadcast range anyway. Feel free to playtest and get back to me on this. On the highest point of the broken bridge around Erifu. Again, maybe within broadcast range anyway. On some of the highest points on the mountaintops in the area near Raven Rock. This is obviously your easiest chance to first listen to the number station. When you tune in, you'll hear an old, familiar voice. Three Dog, despite the fact that you killed him earlier. However, you will quickly notice that he does not seem to be in character. I guess it's not technically Three Dog, but just the voice actor Eric Dillums. He reads a series of numbers in a monotone, depressed sounding voice. He always recites a list of single digits between 9 and 12 characters long. For example, 93791720034. He never uses a multi-digit number like 11 or 40. These numbers are followed by widely varying lengths of Morse code. This is then followed by the song, "I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire." All the other music tracks seem to be inactive on the numbers station. The Morse code was the easiest part of the mystery to crack, as the code is widely available and many people actually know it by heart. We quickly had a list of a great number of messages in English. Some sounded completely mundane and even comical, such as, "Wash the car today, maybe Chinese for dinner," or "Have you watched my YouTube video yet? I uploaded myself kicking bums in the nuts." You may be saying, "But wait, YouTube doesn't exist in the Fallout universe." And you are right. As far as we could tell, all of the messages sounded like they were based in our reality, somewhere near present day. Some of the messages, however, are quite sinister, such as, "The Queen has died today. The world mourns, as on days like these, we are all Brits." Or, "I can't believe they've actually done it. Not long left. The noise. I can't take the noise anymore. I have a pistol in the attic." Just recently, a player on the wiki forums noticed a message that brought to light the meaning of the messages. He was reading a thread that collected all known messages, transponded from Morse code to English, and saw the line 12055282010. "What are you talking about? You will be missed." He realized this is a reference to the recent death. He realized this referenced the death of Gary Coleman, and then quickly realized the numbers were the time and date of death. He immediately scanned through the messages to try and find more examples of this apparent future telling by a game that's years old. The next message he read shocked him and pushed him to enlist the aid of others to decipher the codes. The message was 945420210. Accident in the Gulf. Several dead. Oil spill apparently averted. He realized this was the BP explosion and the erroneous day one assessment that the well was not leaking. From this point on, all numbers will be transcribed as times and dates. All times were given in-game in military format and remained so in this document. Numerous members of the Fallout Wiki message board began looking over the messages to see what else we could learn. We quickly found that most of the dates were after the game had been released, yet oddly, some were from the past. 2215, April 15th, 1865. He's dead, and blame will probably be placed on the actor, Booth. Johnson better not cheat me out of the payment. This shed new doubt on the official version of the Lincoln assassination. As the community quickly started piling up interpretations of the messages, the mods of the site summarily banned everyone who had posted in, or even read the thread. All reference to the number station was removed from the Fallout Wiki, and filtering software was put in place to prevent reposting of any relevant information. A few people, however, are trading emails and slowly finishing the translation of the remaining messages and putting dates to the existing ones. The Queen has died today. The world mourns, as on days like these, we are all Brits. 421, March 19th, 2018. Have you watched my YouTube video yet? I uploaded myself kicking bums in the nuts. 2316, December 24th, 2012. I can't believe Britney's actually won an Oscar. 2133, February 27th, 2023. I can't believe they've actually done it. Not long left. They were warned, but they just had to keep pushing the boundaries of science. The noise, I can't take it anymore. And the light, dear God, The universe is slowly unraveling around us. I'm not going to wait for death. I have a pistol in the attic. This is actually the only message not preceded by a string of numbers. It may be worth noting that the latest entry on any of the messages is 127, July 6th, 2027. I suffer from schizophrenia. Before you jump to any conclusions about me, before that word schizophrenia flashes its stigma and makes you think of serial killers, mass shooters and the like, let me dispel a few things. I am not Norman Bates. I am not Ted Bundy. As a matter of fact, most sufferers of this illness shy away from violence. I do not have multiple personalities. Dissociative identity disorder is a completely different condition than what I have. Most of the time, I'm just like you. I go to work, watch television, I read books, listen to music, indulge my hobbies, and spend time with people I love. I just occasionally see and hear things that aren't really there. When this happens, when I hallucinate or hear voices, I refer to these episodes as experiencing interference, because that's how it feels to me. They are interruptions in my everyday life. It's also a good way for me to signal to someone I trust, who knows about my condition, that I'm in the midst of an episode without having to use that word. I simply tell them, I'm sorry, there's some interference happening, and they understand. Not everyone is understanding. My father was one of those people. I was diagnosed at a very young age. I was only 6 when a child psychiatrist reluctantly wrote schizophrenia onto my diagnostic chart. It's not a diagnosis assigned lightly, especially to children. Most people with this illness don't begin displaying symptoms until late teens or early 20s. I was 6. However, in a weird way, I consider this a blessing. I never had to experience the jarring phenomenon of living a normal life to suddenly having the carpet pulled beneath my feet. Better to be born blind than lose your sight later in life. I've never known anything else. This has also given me a long time to come to terms with my illness and to learn to live with it. I take my medication, and as long as I stay on them, most of my days are just as boring and mundane as everyone else's. Mild episodes will always happen, but the big ones, the ones ranging on the scale of 8 or above, are far and few between. The most difficult thing about living with schizophrenia is not always being able to tell what is real from what is not. Sometimes it's very clear. If I see a purple elephant riding a tricycle through my living room, I can pretty much assume that it isn't real and not give it much thought. The ones that get to me are the more subtle ones. Answering a phone that isn't ringing, responding to someone calling my name when there was no one, attempting to sit in a chair that's not really there. This sort of thing can be extremely embarrassing when they happen in public, so I tend to stay away from most people. I know I come across as creepy to some. Strange. It's like they know there is something off about me, but just can't pinpoint what it is. Another annoying thing about this illness are the delusions. I have been fortunate though. I haven't been plagued by delusions the way some schizophrenics are. I don't believe the government has planted a chip in my brain or that I've been abducted by aliens. I don't buy into conspiracy theories or anything like that. However, there is always that danger. I'm always afraid of going off the deep end that way, so I avoid anything that might trigger it. Sometimes, all it takes is for a simple idea to take root. a word, a phrase. It's not always purple elephants. Oftentimes, it's something much worse. One thing I avoid above all else is religion. I don't mean to sound disrespectful to anyone who is religious. A common delusion for schizophrenics to fall into is the belief that they are hearing the voice of God, or that their hallucinations are actually angels or demons trying to show them visions. I've even had well-meaning people tell me that I'm not really mentally ill at all, that I'm gifted. I can see into the spiritual realm, whereas others cannot. Of course, that's ridiculous. This is not a gift. Yet, I do fear someday believing it. Who wouldn't want to believe that they are special that way? I suppose that's why it's such a common thing. Yet, it's very dangerous thinking. As appealing as the notion of being chosen by God is, the reality is that I have an illness. It isn't pretty. It isn't romantic. It just is. Besides that, I don't have such a great track record with religion. My father, I mentioned him earlier, was a Southern Baptist preacher in the backwoods of Louisiana, where I grew up. He was a devout Christian and held his family, including myself, to strict standards. We were examples for the community, and he took that position very seriously. In public, anyway. Behind closed doors, things were quite different. My father drank heavily and had a hellfire and brimstone temper. It went even beyond that, however. There was a meanness in him, a side the rest of the congregation never saw. He reveled in his position of power over his followers, and that bled heavily into our home life. We weren't his family. We were his flock. You see this scar from the corner of my mouth? That was delivered with a strip of barbed wire. I could show you my arms and back as well, but I keep those covered. No matter the weather, I'm always in long sleeves. Having a schizophrenic son was not news my father took well. At first, he didn't believe there was such a thing. He was convinced I was behaving this way for attention, claiming to see things that weren't real. Then, it got more sinister. My father became seized with the idea that I was in fact possessed. My hallucinations were satanic visions. I was hearing the voice of the devil. That's when I stopped being human in my father's eyes. I was no longer his son. I was a thing to be tormented whenever he saw fit. He derived a sick pleasure in not just physical torture, the beatings, the burns, the chokings, the cuts, but the psychological torture as well. He stopped calling me by my name and instead used nicknames like Schizo or his personal favourite, Hellspawn. He enjoyed taking advantage of my fragile psychological state. He would say or do things he knew would trigger an episode, and then use that as further evidence that I was filled with the devil. One day, when I was about 7, he came home in a drunken stupor as usual, but this time he clutched something in his left hand as he staggered through the front door. At first, I thought it was some sort of dead rodent, but when he brought it into the light, it was clear. It was a teddy bear, torn in places, with matted fur and bald spots. In his gravelly, slurred voice, he tossed it at my face and said, "Here you go, Hellspawn. Pulled that out of the dumpster for you. Mind you, watch out, it's got a mind of its own." With that, he plopped on the sofa and passed out. Mind of its own. That's all it took. That simple phrase, a seed was planted. I regarded the haggard thing my father had thrown at me. It stank. I believed him when he said he pulled it from the garbage. My first inclination was to just throw it away. In a few hours, my father would probably not even remember giving it to me. I would never miss it. But what if he did? What if he got angry that I tossed it out? Hanging onto a smelly, rotten, stuffed animal seemed more appealing than whatever punishment my father might inflict on me, so I took it up to my room. This was most likely some sort of mind game. He wanted to see how long he could make me keep this thing, make me sleep with it, make me take it to school, make me eat meals with it. As his petty torments went, this seemed pretty mild, so I figured I could take it. It was just an old bear after all. But those words kept seeping into my brain. Mind of its own. I began to regard the bear with suspicion. When I was 7, I didn't have the discernment skills to be able to tell when a delusion or an episode was about to overtake me. I'm much older now and I've lived with this for years. I now have the coping skills and strategies I can use to combat things like this. But back then, I did not. I stared into the beady, plastic eyes of the bear, and I could feel it staring back at me. It has a mind of its own. I threw the bear across the room. It landed face down on the wooden floor. I decided then that I wasn't going to take it into the bed with me. I would just leave it there on the floor. I went to bed, and after what felt like hours of lying still with one eye fixed on the bear, I managed to fall asleep. I'm not sure how long I slept. It may have been a couple of hours or just a few minutes, but I was awakened by a strange wooden sound. I say wooden because it sounded like snapping twigs and creaking branches. When I opened my eyes, they were already pointed in the direction where the bear laid, still on the floor. But now it was changing. Its furry limbs twisted and lengthened in a jerking and unnatural way. That was the cracking noise I was hearing. Its arms and legs grew and jerked, lengthening and thinning like spider legs. Finally, it lifted its head from the floor. It was swollen to several times its original size, and distended across from fluffy ear to fluffy ear was a row of sharp teeth that dripped with drool. It opened its jaw and released a roar that shook the room. I felt its hot breath hit me in the face, and I bolted from the bed. I ran into the hall and headed for the stairs. Behind me, I could hear the sound of cracking wood as the thing lifted itself to its feet. I turned to look, and it scrambled behind me, walking on spindly legs and using its spider-like arms to dig its claws into the opposite walls of the hallway to propel itself forward. The house rattled with its growls. As I reached the stairs, I slipped on the top step and tumbled to the bottom floor. I twisted my ankle in the process and couldn't get back to my feet. I looked up the stairs, and staggering its way down was this monstrosity. No longer a teddy bear, but a scarecrow-like thing with the skin of a teddy bear stretched across its wooden skeleton. It opened its mouth again and spoke. "It's lovely out in the woods today, but safer to stay at home, for every bear that ever was will gather there for certain, because today's the day the bears have their picnic." I screamed and closed my eyes, sliding myself back across the floor like a slug. I began reciting a nursery rhyme that sometimes brought me comfort when I was having an episode. I tried to remind myself that this wasn't real. As I was going up the stairs, I met a man who wasn't there. He wasn't there again today. I wish he'd go away. As I was going up the stairs, I met a man who wasn't there. He wasn't there again today. I wish he'd go away. I whispered this to myself over and over. When I opened my eyes, I was in my mother's arms. She was shaking me and calling my name. I looked past her worried face and up the stairs. My father stood at the top, with the bear in his hands. "What's wrong with him now?" he asked. "I'm not sure," she said. "I think he had another night terror." "Figures," my father said in that familiar, dismissive tone. "Gonna chain you to the bed, boy, if you don't cut this out." He threw the bear at me again and disappeared into the hallway. My mother carried me back up to bed. For the next few nights, this happened again and again. The bear would transform into the monster, chasing me. My mother would find me in various places of the house, hiding in closets or in cabinets, shaking and reciting nursery rhymes. After the 6th night, my mother begged my father to let her get rid of the bear. She offered to burn it, bury it, whatever it took. My father just smugly smiled and said, "You'd burn a gift a father gave to his son? How ungrateful." Somehow, my father was still more terrifying than anything my broken mind could invent. Even so, the constant disturbances during the night were wearing on him too, so he made good on his promise to restrain me to my bed. The 7th night, he tied me down with rope and sat the bear square on my chest. "Sleep tight," he said as he closed my bedroom door. It wasn't long before I felt vibrations on my chest and a low growl began to rise from the bear. Slowly, its mouth began to stretch across its face in a toothy, distended fashion. Immediately, I closed my eyes and began to recite the rhyme. Over my own voice, though, I could hear that crackling sound. It was growing again, transforming. I abandoned the rhyme and instead began to scream. I called for my mother. I struggled and strained against the ropes until they began to cut my wrists, and I felt blood trickle down my arm. I could hear voices in the hall. My mother first. "Let me go to him, please. He's having a nightmare." Then my father. "Stop babying him. He's driving us all crazy as he is. You want to stop it? I'll make it stop." What happened next is a blurry mix of hallucination and reality. To this day, I'm not quite sure what actually transpired. I remember my father bursting into my room. I remember the door flinging open and crashing against the wall behind. I remember the crackling noise the bear made as it grew. I remember the bear's voice. "Today is the day the teddy bears have their picnic." There was a scream, but not my own this time. My eyes were clenched tightly shut, and I just kept repeating. As I was going up the stairs, I met a man who wasn't there. He wasn't there again today. I wish he'd go away. There were growls and roars, crashes, the sound of ripping flesh and screaming, and silence. Finally, my mother came in. She saw me tied to the bed and ran to me, frantically removing the ropes from my bloody wrists. My father was nowhere to be seen. The bear lay face down on the wooden floor, as it had the first night when I had thrown it aside. After attending to my wounds and making sure I was all right, my mother asked me, "Where is your father?" I looked up at her and simply shook my head. That was nearly 30 years ago. The community assumed that my father must have wandered away in a drunken stupor and had some sort of accident. There was a search in the nearby woods, but nothing was ever found. I still have the teddy bear. Never since that night has it ever transformed again. It's just a bear. Just an old, worn teddy bear with dead plastic eyes and balding fur. When I first saw it, it frightened me. But I was just a child then. And now I understand that it was all a delusion brought on by my illness. However, for reasons I can't quite describe, I have a certain respect for this old thing. Sometimes, the scariest things in this world are just misunderstood, sort of like me. After all of us have a mind of our own. It took me longer than the other kids to grow out of cartoons. I loved all those childhood classics that were featured on Cartoon Network, Nickelodeon and such. It's funny, if you go on any nostalgia blogs nowadays, you'll see people acting like they always loved cartoons. But I bet there was a time they denounced their love just to seem cool. Anyway, this carried over when I was in my early years of high school and bored in IT class. Everyone was just doodling away on paint, playing flash games, or reading random pages found on the web. We had one of those teachers that never really cared about what we did as long as the work was done. My favourite cartoon at the time that I was binging was Batman the Animated Series. Out of boredom, I was just searching away random pages on search engines. First, I typed in Batman the Animated Series Trivia, which came up with a plethora of random facts about the show. I then found some little interviews about the behind the scenes and making of, which was pretty interesting. After hearing the same facts over and over though, I changed things up a bit. I decided to search for fan sites to see what others thought of the show. First, I found some popular blogs sharing fanfictions and theories. I even found a few hate pages which peeved me. But alas, I eventually fell into a monotonous grind through the pages of search results. I eventually hit the double-digit figures of search pages, which is when you find the more bizarre and less relevant pages. I came across some role-playing forums, illegal streaming sites of the show, and even a fanatic who acted out episodes in costume. I was just mindlessly clicking through these until I hit a generic, albeit amateur-looking page. It had a generic spiel about how they loved the show, and there were pages of commentary written down on an episode-by-episode basis. I was curious, but as I was getting into things, a pop-up came up. You have been selected for a chance to win £100,000. Obviously, I'd been warned by my parents to be cautious about things that are too good to be true. But I was also at that age where I felt I was destined for something special, and this could be it. I hesitantly clicked on it, and it led to some questionnaire, one question at a time. First, it asked a generic question about Batman. Luckily, I had been reading all the hidden details of the show and proudly clicked the right answer in the drop-down. Correct, it congratulated me with. This gave me a great feeling and a small shot of adrenaline. This could be it. I could be rich in a matter of seconds, was the thought racing in my mind. This all left me on the next question. What is your name? I was hesitant now. I was especially warned to never fill in personal details on the internet. Class was ending soon and I needed to be fast. If I answered, I could get in trouble, and if I left it, this opportunity would slip me by. In a panic, I looked around my class for inspiration, and my eyes met with the people in my class. Then I came up with a genius idea. I could use someone else's name. First, I looked at my best friend. If all this turned out to be legitimate, he would definitely understand and share the wealth with me. However, if he got in trouble, I would feel like I betrayed him. I was scared to ask him as I didn't want him to laugh at me in case this was all fake. Next, I turned to the big kid at the back of the class. Pete was basically the school bully. I thought if things went sour, I wouldn't mind him taking the fall. He'd gotten away with so much in this school that anything bad happening to him would be karmic justice. But then I thought of the potential good. and how he wouldn't even think twice about keeping all the money to himself. Time was running out and I had to act quick. I could see some people packing away their stationery early to leave quickly for the upcoming lunch break. Then, the perfect idea hit me. Dexter. He was basically the class nerd. This name didn't help him, leaving him the most cliché nickname, Point Dexter. He was weak-willed, easily pushed around. A bad quality to have, but if he got the money, I could easily sway him into being on my side and splitting the pool with me. And if things went sour, I could easily deny any connection. I didn't really have much connection with him, and I wasn't that type of kid, so no one would suspect me. It was the perfect choice. I quickly typed in his name, which led to a box for his address. I had it offhand from his birthday party flyer, which no one showed up to. It would have been social suicide to have shown up. I pulled out the creased flyer from my backpack and hastily filled it in. After that, the pop-up just thanked me and closed. It was anticlimactic to say the least. It was just in time though, as everyone was flooding out for lunch and I didn't want to look suspicious, so I closed everything down and left. Weeks went by and seemingly nothing happened. I didn't want to ask Dexter about it, as I didn't want to look stupid that I'd fallen for such a thing, and I didn't want him to know I was filling in his details on random sites. He certainly never acted different in that time, so I figured he hadn't received the money. It was slowly hitting me that I may have been duped. I was watching him at lunch to see if he brought anything with him that may show he secretly received a lump of money, but he just pulled out some simple sandwiches and a chocolate bar. One thing I did notice though was that he was acting kind of skittish. He would occasionally pop his head up from eating, look around with wide eyes, and strafe back down to eat some more. I figured he was just looking out for kids who were looking to grief him. He really was a big target for many bullies. A week or two later, and things started getting more noticeable, but not in a good way. His grades started slipping. Now, he was known as Point Dexter for a reason. He was so smart, he usually knew things the teachers didn't. But now, he was noticeably lacking behind. His behavior was becoming more erratic too. He would sometimes lash out at other kids if they walked too close to him and caught him off guard. He would start screaming, seemingly at random. This started to distress the other kids, me included, and Dexter had to be sent out every so often to calm him down. I started to feel like this was my fault. I put together that this all started after I filled in his details on that pop-up. I nonchalantly brought this up to my mom. The behavior, not the pop-up. And she gave me an interesting explanation. As lightly as possible, she told me he's a little special. She explained that he might act odd from time to time because he had mild autism. I later learned that he was diagnosed on the cusp of the spectrum where he could be in school with the regular kids, which is an offer his parents took up. This explanation was easy to stomach, and as bad as this sounds, I rejoiced inside, knowing it wasn't my fault. Time went by, and things were getting worse. He would show up to school, exhausted and pale, dark circles around his eyes. I no longer felt bad about the pop-up though. I more felt sorry for his parents. I couldn't imagine what it was like for them. But I just accepted this as how things were. Eventually, his behavior got so out of hand that he had to be taken out of class regularly. Usually, he didn't make it past 10 minutes in class before needing to be sent out. It didn't matter anyway. All he'd do was stare out the window with his crazy wide eyes until he would start screaming and panicking away. It was too disruptive to be sorted out every time it happened. It wasn't long until he stopped showing up completely. I asked my parents about it, and they were oddly quiet about it. I asked the other kids, but they said they had a similar response from their parents. We were simply constantly told not to worry. A week later, in more inquiries, all the parents, seemingly at the same time, all started telling us that they simply moved Dexter to a special needs school which could accommodate his condition. Some of the other kids didn't believe their parents, but it was spread enough that it was eventually settled as truth. Now, the reason I'm telling you all this is because of what I found out recently. I found out what really happened. He didn't move. He was kidnapped. On his bed was a note left in scratched, barely legible writing saying, "Dexter is a greedy boy. Dexter is a greedy boy. Dexter is a greedy boy." Over and over again. After he went missing, a silent search operation was conducted around the town to see if they could find him. While searching the industrial estate to see if he was hiding away in an abandoned warehouse, they found his body. His body was stuffed with coins and notes recently stolen from a bank. There was also evidence of the worst things imaginable having happened to him, but you don't need me to describe them to you. It was decided to be kept from the kids to stop fear-mongering and trauma. Plus, telling the kids wouldn't have made us more safer anyway. This wasn't a random kidnapping. There was plenty of evidence that it was premeditated, planned, and was a one-off. However, no evidence could be found of a motive. Except for what I know. I think I may have gotten my classmate killed. When I was about 10 years old, my family moved. We ventured to a semi-suburban part of Georgia where my parents opted for one of the older neighborhoods rather than the newer clusters of uniform homes. The neighborhood we selected, Ivy Cascades, possessed a haphazard layout, with the homes and roads built along the tops of deep ravines and steep hillsides. My parents settled on an older, two-story brick home situated at the top of one of those ravines. I remember standing on our driveway, looking down that hill in wonder. It was one endless expanse of ivy, with thickets of underbrush, weeds, and trees clinging to the precipitous banks. I tried as hard as I could to make out the bottom, but it was lost in the green swirls of foliage. As we moved everything into our home, I gradually gained more and more freedom as my parents found less use for their scrawny son. I turned to the family dog for entertainment. Dyson, our 2-year-old Labrador retriever named after a vacuum brand, took to our massive yard with glee. I hunted with my father, and we trained Dyson to live up to his breed. Though he got distracted from time to time, the robust lab never seemed to tire of romps through the trees. To placate my boredom, I took Dyson out to the driveway and found a red ball in the garage for him to fetch. Together, he and I made our way to the edge of the driveway. "Come on, boy, what's this? Wanna play? Wanna play?" Dyson nosed my leg and spun in circles, his eyes fixated on the ball. I tortured him a moment longer by holding it aloft, pretending not to know what he wanted, before a pitiful whine finally broke my cruelty. I launched the ball as far as I could, and Dyson went after it, a bolt of yellow shuffling down the deep ivy slope. My eye stayed glued on the ball until it disappeared in the leaves. Never before had I thrown something so far or high. I knew in reality it was the angle of the ravine, but still a sense of power swelled in my chest. I waited for my loyal friend to return, eager to try it again. It took longer than expected, but eventually Dyson reappeared, ball in jaw, slowly clambering up the side of the hill. The ravine must have been deeper than I thought. Once he crested the hill, he plopped onto the side, panting and happy. I eased the ball from his mouth and bounced it teasingly. He looked at me reluctantly, fighting between his desire to fetch and to loaf about. Eventually, the retriever in him won, and he stood. With glee, I whipped the ball hard and long into the green abyss, and Dyson followed it. This time, I watched the dog, rather than the ball. The lumbering, yellow animal had all the stealth of a bulldozer as he tromped down the ivy hill, but eventually he was swallowed up once more. I sat at the edge of the driveway, kicking my feet and enjoying the Georgia sun on my shoulders. It took a couple minutes longer this time around, until I heard the rustles of my faithful lab trundling up the ravine again. He looked tired, but happy. A long, pink tongue poked out to one side of the ball as he picked his way up and reached the top of the incline. I hugged him tight and spoke to him in a sappy voice, telling him what a good boy he was in the same way my father did when he retrieved a bird. There were a couple of scratches along his snout and jowls, but I figured they were from thorns or branches. He dropped the ball in my lap and pushed his head against my chest, clearly wanting more of the same treatment. I indulged him for another minute, building up to what I wanted in return. I held up the ball one more time, and he whined. Something almost human glinted in his brown eyes. Hesitancy, perhaps? Fear? I didn't listen. I should have, but I didn't. I was 10 years old, infused with the power of throwing a ball farther and longer than perhaps any 10-year-old preceding me. Dyson pressed his head to my chest again as I stood. "Come on, boy, just one more time," I said, rubbing his ears. He wagged his tail a couple of times, giving me enough reason to launch the ball once more. Dyson followed after it loyally, navigating the ivy-laden terrain with impressive speed. I watched him go and sat down again to wait. The swirls of bright green leaves and deeper emerald ivy soon drew me into a trance. They moved with the wind, relaxing me as I waited. I must have held that trance for 15 minutes, zoning in and out of the world around me. A thud from behind me caught my attention. It was my dad, dropping a couple boxes in the garage before the door slammed behind him. I shifted my weight nervously. Dyson still hadn't returned. I waited for another 10 minutes, then another 5, then an extra 10 to be safe. But there was no sign of him. There were a number of things I knew could have happened. When we were hunting, there were always possibilities our dog would get distracted or injured. But this was a residential neighborhood, not the wilderness. I went and got my dad. After explaining what happened, he told my mum to take me inside while he went looking. The thick vegetation would be difficult to navigate without the proper equipment, so he dressed in his hunting gear. My heart beat wildly as my mum tried to calm me, but I didn't listen to her. A sense of fear had been mounting in my chest. Not outright terror, but dread. Together, my mum and I waited for hours as my father combed the ravine and surrounding area. I could hear him tromping through the undergrowth, cursing on occasion as he slipped on dead leaves or some ivy. He found no sign of Dyson. We all came to the same hopeful conclusion that he got distracted and wandered off, that a neighbour had found him and would call us soon, but I could tell my father shared my doubts. That lab was trained, loyal, and able-bodied on difficult terrain. Rubbing his eyes, my dad told us we'd continue to search tomorrow, put out flyers, talk to people. Though it would be difficult seeing as we'd just moved in. By the time my father had returned, It was close to nightfall. We opted for an early dinner, which passed in dreary silence, and then an early night. I went to bed after kissing my parents goodnight. My dad held my back for a moment, reassuring me and telling me this wasn't my fault. I suppose he thought it helped, but even at my age, there was an awareness to these heavy situations where I knew some of the blame was mine. Sleep did not come. My bedroom, which sat at the back corner of the house with a big window overlooking the ravine, waved with leafy shadows. I watched them, falling into a similar trance as earlier that day. Hours passed this time, but I didn't care. The shadows were comforting in a way, just an endless sea of leaves. I'm not sure when the scratching started, but I noticed it when my clock read 2:38. It was a feeble, pathetic sound emanating from the base of my door. It sounded very much like someone was digging from the other side. I shivered and leaned over my bed to lower my eyeline with the space beneath the door. I could just make out something black scrabbling at the wood flooring. It dug with ferocity. Gulping down my fear, I let my hope of Dyson's possible return guide me to the door. I slipped across the room, feeling the shadows accompany my movements as I neared the door. Slowly, I grasped the door handle and yanked the door open to reveal nothing. An empty hallway with boxes cluttered at the other end and patchy spots of paint covering the wall. At the other end, the hallway dead-ended at a curving staircase, which led to the front door. My thin chest was pulsing as I lingered in the doorway of my room for any sounds. Part hope and part fear kept there. Wanting it to be Dyson, or for it to be nothing at all. Worst of all, it could be something else. I heard the scratching again. It came from down the hall, from down the stairs, outside the front door. For a moment, I considered just going back to bed. But guilt and longing for my dog led me through that hall, down the stairs, and to the front door. This time, I didn't hesitate. I could hear the scratching at our door, clear as a bell. I grabbed the handle and yanked it open. Nothing again. Just an empty stoop and a brick walkway leading off to the driveway. With a sigh, I shut the door and went back to my room. The adrenaline wore off pretty quick. My PJs were soaked with sweat, so I got changed before climbing back into bed. This time, sleep came quite quickly. Something awoke me at 5:42 in the morning. I wasn't sure what. Outside was a dark grey overcast with just the barest hints of sunlight seeping through. I didn't hear scratching or see shadows on my ceiling or black things clawing at my door. It felt oddly surreal and tranquil. I slipped from my bed and got dressed. There was something I wanted to see. I slipped into the garage and opened it from within. It slid open slowly, so I ducked under it. From there, I ventured toward the edge of the ravine again and peered into it, trying to find the bottom. I wasn't sure how far or deep my dad had ventured down there, but he'd been gone for hours. He didn't know about the scratching either. Why couldn't my father, a lifetime hunter, find our big, yellow dog in the middle of a suburban neighborhood? I tried to focus, my 10-year-old mind envisioning nothing but my father and my dog venturing down into the same ravine. Both were trained, both were comfortable in the wilderness, both had every reason to come home. Then, a revelation hit me, or at least the most logical solution a kid could think of. My dad had been searching for our dog, and our dog had been searching for a ball. You didn't look for dead things the same way you looked for the living. Yes, this dead thing was a ball, but a search for an inanimate object was more invasive than a hunt. My dad would have scanned the area for our dog, but Dyson, in his search for the ball, would have probed it, invaded it with his heightened sense of smell, and he'd been successful the first 2 times. Something went wrong that last time. I had to discover what. Rubbing my chin, I headed back to the garage and dug through a couple boxes until I found what I wanted: another rubber ball. It was a long shot, even for a kid, but I couldn't think of nothing else. Plus the sky above was an ominous grey, with shaggy clouds so dark they looked purple looming. I needed to do this now. Treading back to the edge of my driveway, I tossed the ball in my slim hands. It was a neon blue ball, so at least it would stand out. I took it in one hand, cocked my arm, and lobbed it down the slope. As it sailed down, I slid after it, skidding through the thick tangles of ivy. The ravine was deeper than I thought, far deeper. At least 500 feet of sheer, dead leaf covered the slope, shrouded in a layer of foliage thicker than the cloud cover above. As I descended, I noticed something else. The trees that grew along the ravine's precarious edge darkened all that was beneath, leaving everything that grew 60 feet or more from the top in a perpetual twilight. It all looked stunned and gnarled, with stubbier trees and pitiful bushes fighting for the limited sunlight shining through their brethren. I made the mistake of touching one of the trees and pulled back to find its trunk slimy and moist. A black, oily substance coated my fingers. I had to keep myself from gagging as I reminded myself why I was here. There was a ball somewhere further down, so I kept going. As I delved further into the rotting depths of the ravine, I noticed that the only plant life that did not change was the ivy. It blanketed the slope in emerald tendrils, stealing its share of the light and choking other plants. More than once, I saw trees absolutely covered by its infectious dominance. The trees resembled giants, taken over by time and petrified under cloaks of ivy. I kept searching for the ball, hoping to spot a spark of artificial blue in the world of undulating greens, browns, and blacks. The further I went, the thicker the ivy grew. My method of descent was to press myself against the leaves and slip down little by little. My left foot was extended in front of me, and the right remained hitched to the side of the hill. I continued to slide, feeling my way around and trying to ignore the ivy giants hunched over. About halfway down, my left foot hit a deadfall. Some leaves caked atop a cluster of roots, and it broke through before I realized I hit empty air. I tumbled forward, crying out, and slammed into the dirt hard. It didn't hurt terribly, but the impact did knock the wind from my lungs. I sucked in a breath, gaping like a fish as I scrambled to my feet. A clod of mud and roots lodged itself in my hair, and I shook it free. Something glinted in the corner of my eye. The ball. It lay nestled at the top of a large cascade of ivy, which draped downward like a curtain. It must have fallen off the top of the thing. I reached forward to pick up the ball, but caught my finger on something sharp when I tightened my hand around it. Quickly, I withdrew my hand, sucking on the finger and tasting the liquid as it seeped forth. Once I staunched the flow, I took a closer look. Whatever caught me was metal, rusty and curved. It seemed to follow straight up from the slope at a similar angle to the cascade of ivy. I guessed it was an old sewer opening, completely overgrown by ivy. A cold feeling of unease slithered down my back, similar to what I'd felt that night. Above, a low peal of thunder echoed through the trees, but I would be damned if I headed back now. Ever so carefully, I leaned forward and lifted one of the strands. Something dull and brown glinted back at me, along with a sudden flash of yellow. I almost screamed until I realized it was my dog. I'd found him. I leaned forward to give him a hug, but he growled softly, remaining absolutely still. I looked at his eyes. Something almost human resided there. His tail thumped softly, but the rest of him remained shrouded by ivy. I tentatively reached a hand forward and lifted another vine free. Dyson licked my hand once as I screamed and recoiled. He lay on his side, a massive wound torn through his middle. The poor lab's intestines were strewn out on the cruddy metal floor, snaking back into the darkness of the tunnel. My heart pulsed and my ears roared as blood rushed to my head. I almost threw up, but my dog, for the final time, gave me that almost human look. Just before, something yanked on his guts and pulled him back into the darkness with an inhuman screech. I sat there, babbling, pale and cold. I had thrown a ball down that ravine 3 times, and he'd retrieved it every time, in spite of whatever resided in that sewer. I knew I had to get out of there, to get away. My lab warded me off with his growl, saved me, but I couldn't move. I peered into the darkness, tears flowing freely and mixing with the blood staining my hands. Then something bounced forward out of the darkness. It was a ball, a red ball. It was crusted in blood, and 2 words were smeared along its surface. "Wanna play?" It was rather late at night, and I was returning home from a party. As exhausted as I was, I somehow stumbled into my car, navigating my way through a dark route. Once there, I popped my phone into the charger and set the map for home. I would say it was around 1 or 2 a.m. at this time, and I was ready to pass out. But I trekked on into the night. Listening as Siri told me, I got onto the highway that normally takes me home and prepared myself for the half-hour voyage. It was odd. As I merged onto the expressway, there was an absence of cars. And this wasn't some abeyance of traffic either. After driving for 15 minutes, I didn't witness one other vehicle. I guessed this could have been a coincidence and kept on following the route home. Thoughts from the hectic night began racing through my head, and admittedly, I wasn't entirely sober enough to be behind the wheel. Regardless, I was aware of what was happening enough to recapture the night. I was catching up with old college friends, and we spent our time reliving the events we relished so much together at our university. It was refreshing. It felt like being a student all over again. Unfortunately, my tangent of anecdotes was interjected by that robotic voice emanating from my phone. In 1 mile, take exit 21 to merge onto Murphy Boulevard. As always, I was a bit annoyed at Siri's constant reminders, but I knew it was for the best as she was my only guide home. After taking the exit, I began scanning the radio for songs. Particularly, I was looking for the best of the 90s to accentuate the get-together with my buds. I wasn't getting too many stations on the receiver and continued to fiddle with it. Some hazy, fuzzy clamour seemed to almost spill from the speakers. It wasn't the standard sound produced by a non-existent channel, but rather it was the sound of rustling leaves and the frequent break of a twig. Trying to eliminate the irritating cacophony, I continued to tweak the dial. Pulling harder on the knob, it popped off and fell onto the passenger's side of the car. I reached over to grab it, and once again was interrupted. Turn left onto Simon Road. Out of instinct, I slammed my foot on the brake. With the position I was in, my body rocketed forward as the car brusquely came to a halt. In the process, my head jeered into the glove box, and I was left with a severe migraine. "God damn it," I said to myself as I rubbed my face and sluggishly shifted my body back into my seat. My eyes darted left and right. They examined each mirror, but once again, no one was on the road. In my 20 or so minutes on the road, I hadn't witnessed one other person. This was truly peculiar, I thought. Despite the oddity, I let my hands fall back on the wheel and pressed the accelerator. Just a couple more minutes, I thought. I made a sharp left and headed down the road back home. Once driving down this road at a slower speed, I felt more comfortable. It would have only been a few miles till I was home, and my headache was beginning to subside. Siri began to dictate once again, but my focus refused to acknowledge her, as a lifeless blob on the side of the road distracted me. As my car rolled closer to it, I noticed the object attempting to inch its way off of the street, yet in some sort of struggle. I couldn't discern much of what was happening, so I turned on my brights. I felt as though a new realm previously invisible had just been revealed. With clear vision, this puzzling creature became fully visible. I first noticed a trail of dark, almost colourless blood smeared across the street. This streak originated from a location beyond my area of visibility. However, it had a distinct endpoint. The painter of this river of red was a dog. Or maybe I should say, half a dog for that matter. The poor pup was dragging what remained of its torso along the pavement, stretching out its two front paws and desperately grasping for new ground with each reach. Its exposed ribs barely managed to retain its intestines, which were strung out several feet behind the animal, yet still attached, and being carried along in its battle for life. Hushed whimpers escaped the dog's vocals as it continued to meander across the landscape. Initially, I sat in my stopped car, thinking this was the most grotesque roadkill I'd ever come across. However, at a second glance, I noted the tracks it had created with its own remains and outpouring of plasma. I also analysed the creature and could see deep scratches that exposed its fat, clearly torn muscles that appeared ripped rather than mushed. This was no result of a tire. This dog had met its fate from a predator, and something else was out there, in the woods, that had devoured it as prey. As the dog nearly found its footing on the other end of the asphalt, a ringing began blaring from my radio. I figured I must have left it on full volume on some blank station. As much pity as I felt for the dog, it was late and I needed to return home. About a minute after leaving the gruesome scene, Siri was imminent on giving directions. She stated over and over again for miles, "Make a U-turn." I ignored her. As usual, Apple Maps was giving me false directions. I wouldn't be able to disregard it for long. The roads I was sure I was familiar with seemed to have transformed into completely unrecognizable routes. I made turn after turn on my own for about half an hour before even glancing at my phone. The area I was in was fairly rural and lowly populated. Most of the streets I took led to dead ends or farms. Confused out of my mind, I picked up my phone. By this time, I was irate. It was extremely late, and my phone failed to bring me back home. I checked my location and zoomed out. At this moment, I became fully confused. I had to rub my eyes. There was no way this was possible. The digital map had shown my location on a road name that was no more than 5 minutes from my house. When I expanded my view, I noticed that there was a separate road with the exact same name. In fact, Murphy Boulevard and Simon Road were also duplicated. The streets were about half an hour away from each other, but were exactly the same. They didn't just have the same name, they made the same turns, had the same intersections. Even the colouring of the pavement looked copied. This just didn't make any sense to me. Something was clearly wrong with my maps. My mind was flourishing with questions, and I fell victim to my curiosity. I honed in on my location and flicked the screen up. I cautiously swiped onto the road to ensure I didn't miss a thing. Stopping at the intersection, I moved my finger across to motion left. I made a few more taps up on the device and ceased my navigation. I could feel each breath becoming more difficult to take as I gazed down at my phone. Every part of me trembled as my heart began to race. Sweat perspired in the layer between the palm of my hand and my phone. What I was looking at was no duplicate street or road. It was a satellite picture of my house, located several miles away in a different town. I had to go see it. It was late, I was on the verge of passing out, but I had to check it out. With little trust in Siri and the directions, I cut off my ties to technology. I trusted my memory and headed, quote-unquote, home. I barreled down the dirt road I was accustomed to, turned into the neighborhood, and ventured down the eerily familiar road to my house. My foot wasn't even on the accelerator. I didn't have the necessary courage to blatantly arrive at this destination. I simply let the car roll forward no more than 5 miles an hour. The velocity at which my hand was racing juxtaposed this sluggish stroll. As more and more thoughts balked my sanity, a tingling sensation pushed through my body. A massive accretion of fear had become impossible to subside now. When I finally arrived in front of the house, it was as if all my certainties that the iPhone was just broken had been shattered. It was no longer a virtual image. It became a reality. Less than 100 feet from me stood the exact house I'd been living in for years. There wasn't a single noticeable difference in the frame. I creaked open my door and softly shut it to avoid alarming anyone. I tiptoed up the driveway and of course saw the same model car as mine. Although I must say, this vehicle displayed little signs of wear and tear. It actually looked brand new, covered in a shiny blue lacquer. My inspection of the car was cut short when the neighbor's dog began to bark at me. I almost fled inside to silence the alerting dog, but was unable to when my mind made a connection. I only had a quick glance in the dark, but I was almost sure of something when I saw the dog. The dog hobbled over to me as its barks abated. The creature only had 3 legs, but made the best of its mobility. The disturbing aspect of this wasn't the lack of a limb. Peering into the eyes of this dog made it clear that this dog was no different from the one I had seen on the side of the road, other than the fact that it had 3 legs and not 2. What the hell is going on? I thought. Someone must have found this dog and stitched him back up. I refuted this claim quickly as there was no way that canine could have been repaired. There must have been something out in the woods hunting these animals. The entity that took that first dog's life must have stolen this one's leg. Footsteps echoed in the distance. I crouched behind the automobile to abscond the rays of light illuminating my position. The tiny pup turned its attention to the approaching footsteps. I heard the sound of soles hitting concrete emanate and grow louder. Accompanying it was the noise of dripping and the rummaging and shifting of what sounded to be a tarp, possibly. Fortunately, I soon discovered these were originating from the neighbour walking up his driveway, as they were no longer rising in intensity. The pup now started barking. In accordance with his greet, he dashed towards his owner. The voice that said, "Good boy, yes you are," was no different than that of my new neighbour back at home. I had to get a visual on the event. Moving hastily, I darted my head up above the frame of the car and peeked over the hood. Surely enough, I saw my neighbour patting his three-legged pet on the head, but his other arm was wrapped around a large blue tarp that was blotched with blood and spilling it left and right. The man was distracted by his dog and unravelled the mess he was failing to hold together with one arm. Out of the bundle fell 2 legs, attached by the remaining waist of a dog. I was sure this was the lower half of the animal I had seen suffering earlier. I felt sick to my stomach and felt restrained from moving. I heard the man speak to his dog again. "Look what I got for you, buddy. Brand new." He couldn't possibly be referring to the legs, could he? My curiosity no longer outweighed my terror. I was unwilling to wait any longer. I pushed myself off of the back of the car and began sprinting the 100 feet or so separating me from the beacon of safety. "Hey, what are you doing here?" Before reaching a full-on dash, an unsettling tone beckoned out at me. "Hey, what are you doing here? See, we should have brought you to the harvest zone a while ago." This voice was my own. I overcame the obstacle of fear and motioned my head back as swiftly as I could. The front door to the house was now open, and what I saw surely had resemblance to me, but was far from exact. I looked and saw a disfigured being whose limbs were twisted and disjointed. His skin paralleled the features of leather with its tough and darkly coloured appeal, but his face was the most abject of all. An eye socket remained on the better side, where the other was a mess of flesh and bone. Scarring smothered his cheeks. His gaping mouth displayed few and jagged teeth protruding through his discoloured mushy excuse for gums, and the nose dissipated after an inch, leaving 2 rugged holes in the centre of his face. The hairless, wretched version of me attempted to trek his way towards me on his ruined excuse for legs. I had no interest in finding out what would happen if he were to reach me. I returned to my car with haste and took off. I opened up Apple Maps in the hope of finding a way home. When the app opened itself up, I found myself scrolling through a warped map. At the end of one road, the start of the same one would reappear. I decided I couldn't trust the damn thing and would try and head home on my own. I took roads I knew, roads I didn't. I made hundreds of turns and tried just about every route, but I couldn't escape. No matter where I went, I kept ending up on the same street. Out of options, I had to turn to Apple Maps. I wasn't allowed to enter an address for whatever reason. I tried everything, tweaked every option, but it was set on preventing me from altering its course. A preset location was on it, and I went ahead and followed the directions. Driving my worn car at a slow speed, I listened to each motion. Turn left. I grabbed hold of the wheel and shifted my car left. I wasn't really aware of where I was going, but I remained driving. Continue for 1 mile, then turn right. I did as she asked, and I was gradually starting to recognize the area. Just as I hit the next corner and prepared to turn, my memory flooded back to me. The distinct sound of rustling leaves once again resonated throughout my car. Siri spoke out. "Drive half a mile and the destination is on your left." I heard some muffled voice under the clamour of leaves and twigs. I turned the radio up to get a better listen. "Is this him?" a deep voice asked. The only response I heard was another man attempting to silence the dialogue. Siri iterated. "Destination is on your left in 400 feet. The pace I drove at slowed. The indistinguishable muffles over the radio subsided. As I drifted closer and closer, a high-pitched ringing grew louder. I now realized this wasn't the result of a blank station. Rather, it was the sound of a receiver approaching the source. "The destination is on your left," Siri noted. To my left, two men, both formally clothed in suits, emerged from the thickly wooded area. The larger of the two carried a blade that was a couple feet in length. The other held a radio system with him, with an antenna and what looked to be some sort of hacking device. Time wasn't on my side, as they seemed to inch closer at a rapid rate, despite their slow pace. I pushed my foot on the accelerator. I wasn't prepared for what would unravel. The car was motionless, however. I checked the fuel, and it read empty. Locking my doors and rolling up the windows, I could only sit and watch. Now, only 20 feet or so from my car, the men grinned. One of them was tugging open a garbage bag, as the other lifted his machete from his shoulder in preparation. With my car door now being the only barrier between them and me, I could hear a faint voice speak. "Arrived at destination." Have you ever stared at yourself in the mirror for a very long time? It sounds weird, I know, but I'm sure at least half of you listening to this will have done it. If you stand in silence, staring only into your own eyes for long enough, you'll get this feeling. Those that have done it will know what I'm talking about. It is hard to give a definition of the feeling, as almost everyone has their own way of describing it. Some will even go as far as calling it an out-of-body experience. One thing that everyone seems to agree on, however, is that if done for long enough, staring at yourself in the mirror does not feel right. It's pretty much unexplainable, but eventually something deep within your human mind will scream out that something is wrong, very wrong. Different people take different amounts of time to reach what you may like to call the peak of the feeling. But when they do, they almost have to stop staring. It's like every cell in your body is urging you to get away. But what exactly is it that you so desperately need to get away from? This is just about everything that anyone knows about the feeling. Or, to correct myself, just about as far as anyone has dared to find out. If you decide to take this experiment to its most extreme, you'll find out a little bit more. Heed my warning though, the few people who have gone this far have not come back the same. All of them strongly refuse to report what they saw or experienced. All I can tell you is that what happened to me was extremely disturbing. I'd recommend all of you who do not wish to take this any further to stop listening here. It doesn't take much preparation. All you'll need is a room with a mirror, obviously. A bathroom is probably the easiest. You must be alone, and there must be total silence for this to work. You'll need to make the room as dark as possible, turn out all the lights, and draw the blinds if there are any. Preferably, this should be done at night. Now, go as close to the mirror as you can without your image becoming distorted or blurred. Stare into your own eyes and smile. Nothing over the top, but make sure your teeth are showing. You'll see why later. Yes, I know this is a pretty odd request and it'll feel silly to do, but nobody's watching, right? Now, continue smiling and staring into your own eyes and nothing else. Do not look around the room, no matter what you begin to see or hear. When you get the feeling, you'll know that you're doing the right thing. Continue staring. Now, this is the hardest part. When you reach the peak and get that undeniable desire to get out of that room and run as far as you can, try to resist it. You may be overcome with fear, but just push that emotion away and continue to smile and stare into your own eyes. There's no going back now. You'll know you're past the peak when you get the next feeling. This one is very different and will not be like anything you could imagine experiencing in real life. This whole experience will now seem quite unreal, almost dreamlike, but that means it's working. I guess the only way to describe what you'll feel next is a feeling of unity. Unity between you and the figure staring back at you in the mirror. You see, it'll not seem like you are both the same entity anymore. You may have experienced this during the peak. However, now you will not feel scared of what's in the mirror, but one with it. I cannot say how long it will take for you to feel this, maybe 5 minutes or half an hour. But when you think you do, close your eyes. Continue smiling, but keep your eyes closed. It's almost over. When you're ready, open your eyes, and you'll see why you needed to get away. Remember a while ago when there was some big thing about people having Crystal Pepsi? I don't remember exactly when or what the big deal was, but I remember when my friend offered me a can. Apparently his dad had several cases sitting in his work shed. Now the thing about my friend Dominic is that his parents are weird. It was a little off-putting. His mother collected porcelain dolls and fancy plates. His father collected soda merchandise and coins. They were really intense about their collections, but they were never ones to waste money. I don't think anyone else in the neighborhood had near the same amount of savings as the Price family. They were extremely responsible with their money and weren't against selling valuable pieces of their collection. They both worked steady, well-paying jobs, and they lived in a house well below their means. They didn't spend frivolously just because they could. They planned to have a nice sum to guide them through retirement. Dominic Price wasn't as serious as his parents though. Part of why we were friends was his amazing sense of humor. He was one of the funniest people I knew. He was adventurous, and throughout the years, we'd gotten into all sorts of trouble together. We were infamous among the neighborhood. That's besides the point, because on this day, all our infamous duo was doing was taking one can of Crystal Pepsi from one of the many cases that was stacked in the back corner of the work shed. To keep a story short, we drank a can in the shed. It tasted weird, and it was just a general waste of time. There was one interesting thing I noticed in the shed while we looked around. It was an old keychain with a Pepsi logo on it. It was pretty cool looking. Dom suddenly picked up the keychain and tossed it at me. Want it? Dad's got millions, he'll never notice. I nodded and pocketed the keychain as we left. I knew I shouldn't have taken it, but I did anyways. It was almost like it was a gift from Dom. Anyway, I walked out with a neat trinket, and Dom finished off the gross pop. I didn't think much of our little shed escapade, except to worry that Mr. Price would find out and be upset. It was a week later when I sat down with the Price family for dinner, and my anxiety over being caught was validated. "Have you two been in my work shed recently?" Mr. Price spoke casually, as though he was used to people entering his shed without permission. I looked to Dominic for his reply, because I had no idea if we planned on telling the truth. "Yeah, we tried one of the Crystal Pepsis last weekend," he admitted. His father nodded and asked that we get permission before going into his shed. The rest of the dinner went smoothly, but I couldn't help but feel nervous that Mr. Price knew about what I'd taken. When I left the house that night, I could swear Mr. Price glared at me as we said goodbye. I didn't sleep well that night. I brushed it off as guilt over the petty theft, but the sounds freaked me out. I kept hearing a noise which sounded like someone pacing outside my bedroom window. Over the next week, I wished my room was located on a higher floor, because I swore that something was outside. It tapped and scratched at my window, and several nights I saw a silhouette standing out on the lawn. I was afraid. I thought that maybe Mr. Price was trying to scare me into a confession. If that was the case, it worked. I showed up at their home on a Saturday afternoon, but Dom was out. I admitted that I was actually there to see Mr. Price. We walked into his living room together and each sat in a chair. I pulled the keychain from my pocket. "I'm sorry, Mr. Price. I took this from your shed a few weeks ago." I spoke nervously, rushing to get the words out. "I know, and you kept it from me. You lied about what you took from my shed." His voice was low and stern. It sent a wave of fear through me. I'm sorry." I stuttered out the apology, in no place to correct him on exactly who had told the lie. "Listen," his voice softened. "I normally wouldn't care about a small theft, but this thing is cursed." I stared at him for a moment, waiting for the punchline to this joke. He remained calm and serious, so I just nodded at his statement. Mr. Price was weirder than I thought. "There's something inside it," he continued, but quickly broke into a fit of laughter. "I'm sorry, it's just you almost seem to believe it. This thing does have a history of being stolen, but that's all." I was confused and honestly didn't find the joke very funny after the week I'd had. "Returning it doesn't change the fact that it was stolen and that you lied to my face." I was as polite as possible for the rest of the conversation and left as soon as I could. As I was leaving, I heard Mr. Price call out a final statement to me. "Returning it doesn't change the fact that it was stolen and that you lied to my face." I was stepping out the front door as he said it. I turned to apologize once more, but his wife closed the door in my face. I thought the weird noises and strange figures would go away once I returned the keychain, but nothing changed. I spent another week nearly sleepless before I found myself back at Dom's house for dinner. His mother let me in and led me to the table. Dom was already seated and nodded towards me in a greeting. Mrs. Price left to go to the kitchen, and Mr. Price sat imposingly at the head of the table. There was an odd tension in the air, and I felt uncomfortable sitting there. I noticed that the table hadn't been set, which made me realize how unusual it was for everyone to be seated for dinner so early. When Mrs. Price came back into the room, she was holding a hammer, and her husband suddenly stood. I sat in shock as they walked over to me. I wasn't expecting the hammer to slam down on the hand I'd left resting on the table. I heard the crunch of bone before I screamed. It was the worst pain I'd ever felt, and I was too shocked to move. The hammer came down a few more times, landing squarely on each of my knuckles. I flinched each time I heard my bones breaking, but by the last one, I wasn't sure if I could feel it. My right hand was a useless, mangled mess. Mrs. Price gripped my shoulders as her husband moved away from me. She wasn't very big or imposing, but she was strong enough to keep me in place while I groaned in agony. I don't think I could have moved very much if she hadn't been holding me. The pain was intense. I wanted more than anything to leave, but I couldn't understand why Dom hadn't moved from his seat. That's when Mr. Price pulled his son's seat away from the table, and I saw that his hands were bound. In some places, the punishment for stealing is very costly. Mr. Price smiled. You two are lucky. I stared in disbelief as he held the hammer above Dom's hand. That was the moment when Mrs. Price leaned close and whispered to me, "Run, don't tell anyone what you saw. There's a similar punishment for spreading rumors." She giggled at that, and it sent a chill through my body. No one would believe it either. She gave me a slight shove, and I ran out of the room as the first of Dom's screams rang out. The street was busy, loud. I couldn't hear any screams once I was outside, but I still ran. I ran until I got home, feeling guilty for leaving Dom. They were his parents, though, and I was a skinny teenager. I didn't know how to help. When I got home, my parents were waiting for me. They weren't surprised by my bloody hand. They received a call from Mr. Price where he explained that I'd gotten into a fight with Dominic. Today was the day they planned on moving out of the state, and according to Mr. Price, I was mad that no one had told me that they were leaving. My parents were disappointed in me, assuming my broken knuckles were from a wall I had supposedly put a hole through at the Price home. I went to the hospital about it, and even the doctor told them that it didn't appear to be caused by punching something. They didn't really acknowledge it, too deep in their acceptance of what Mr. Price had said. He was their friend, a fellow parent in the neighborhood. Of course they trusted him. Dominic wasn't in school on Monday, and when I walked by the Price house at the end of the day, it appeared empty. I steeled myself and walked up to the door, knocking softly. No answer. I peeked in a window and found the home devoid of furniture. They really had moved away. It's been years since then, but I've never found a trace of them. I don't know why they believed in such severe punishment for theft, or why someone was outside of my home. Maybe thinking I'd tell my parents and make myself less credible in the end. Regardless, no one has ever believed my side of the story. The only reason I even thought to tell anyone about this is because I found something in an old jacket of mine today. It was an old Pepsi keychain that I know I returned. When I was a kid, my parents had a creek behind our house. It was pretty close, so every day of summer vacation, my brother and I would walk out to it. We would skip rocks or make sandwiches and camp out until supper. Sometimes we'd bring our rods and go fishing, even though we never caught anything. Just skinny grey fish that weren't worth keeping. However, we never went swimming there, except for one time. It was during the first weekend of summer. I had just finished middle school. My brother just got out of 4th grade with all A's, and my parents were exceptionally happy with us. Saturday came around, and when the clock hit 8 in the morning, I woke up my brother, we put on our swim trunks, and we went out to the creek. It was a beautiful spot. The creek's bottle green water danced and shone under the mild morning sun, and we could feel the soft wind brushing past us. On either side of the bank were old willow trees with long thin branches and flat green leaves that hung down like dog's ears. We peeled our shirts off and plastered on sunscreen. Even at the early hours, it was getting warm. My brother didn't bother to change to his swim trunks. He was so set on getting in the water first that he just tore out across our camp on the riverside and pitched himself into the water, completely bare-ass naked. I hobbled and staggered toward the water, trying to put my trunks on and pull them up, yelling at him, "Get back here and put your trunks on, Roger." "I don't need 'em," he yelled back as he floated on his back like an otter does. "What if something swims up your pee hole?" I managed to get my trunks on just in time to hit the water. It was quite a jarring feeling the coolness of it engulf you after having the sun beat down on your back. I bobbed back up just as he spat a mouthful of water right in my eyes. My brother floated there as I laughed and splashed around blind for a second. When my vision cleared up, he was already out in the deeper part of the creek, diving down and coming up like a dabbling duck. "I bet I could touch the bottom. What about you?" "No, I'm fine," I said. "Come on, you scared? I can do it." "Fine." I drew in my breath and went under. Under the water, everything was murky and green-black, with the sunlight stalled at the surface like a frightened camper with a lamp. I swam down past the fallen branches and freshwater weeds, and with a shaky hand, I touched the soft silt of the creek bottom. I pulled back, leaving a palm print on the worm-brown riverbed. As I prepared to swim back up, I saw the outline of a huge fish. It was at least 4 feet long, with a sloping head and wide fins. It drifted around me for a few moments before darting off. I came back up to the surface, gasping for air. My brother was grinning wide. "See? Isn't it fun? Now watch me." I told him to wait a minute, and he cocked his head to the side like a confused dog. "What?" I told him about the fish. His expression didn't change. "So, it's a big fish. I bet I can catch it with my hands." And before I could say anything else, he was under the water. A minute later, he didn't come up. "Roger?" I called his name over and over. I was screaming it loud when he finally shot back up with a clump of river moss on his head. I admit, I jumped a little. "I scared you," he laughed, taking the moss off and throwing it back into the water. "Don't do that again. You were really scared. I thought you were in trouble, you idiot." I had to restrain myself from punching him in that moment. "Jeez, I was just joking." He looked sullen for a bit before he was right back to grinning like a clown. "Hey, I'm going back down. I bet I can catch that big fish." And before I could say anything, down he went. A few seconds later, he bobbed up and was screaming, "Something bit me!" "Roger, that's not funny." Just as those words left my mouth, I noticed a cloud of red that was expanding in the water around him, and my heart stopped. I swam over to get him, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw a dark shape in the water curving back toward him. I grabbed him in one arm and took off toward the shore, swimming harder and faster than I thought I ever could. Roger was thrashing about and shrieking like a dying bird, and my ears were ringing. every so often he would cry out even louder, and I would turn back to see the thing in the water right on our trail. I could see its face in the water. The edge of the creek seemed to move away from us. Finally, we reached land, and I threw him onto the grass and climbed out. My arms and legs were aching down to the bone, and my head was pounding. My brother was shaking and completely silent. I looked over him and saw a patchwork of shallow, red wounds where he had been bitten. My eyes followed them down to his right calf, and I nearly threw up when I saw it. On his calf, a golf ball-sized chunk of flesh was bitten clean off. The wound was deep red and oozing. I snatched up my shirt and wrapped it around the wound. The rest was superficial compared to it. We threw our clothes on and staggered back to our house. When we got inside, I told my mother everything, and her face turned so pale she didn't even yell at us. My father told us never, ever to go there again, but he didn't need to. My brother did not speak. Even when we were in the car driving him to the hospital, he was dead silent for the whole trip. When we walked into the hospital lobby, everyone else there just stopped and stared at us, or rather, the blood-soaked t-shirt wrapped around my brother's leg. A nurse ran up to us and told us that my brother needed to go to the ER. The words emergency room prompted an outburst of dry sobbing from my mother. My father was stone-faced, and my brother was still shaking and looking like a caged rat. He got taken in for surgery. A bald-headed doctor came out and described the damage using words like skin graft and eviscerated tissue. I didn't know what those words meant at the time, but I had a pretty good idea. The doctor cleared his throat. Also, we need to know how he was injured this way. My mom looked at me. I told him about the fish, about how it chased us until we reached dry land. I could tell from his face he didn't really buy it. Are you sure it wasn't some other animal? There aren't many fish around here that can make that kind of wound. My father looked down at me. Was it really a fish? I knew what I saw. I told him as such. The doctor said, "We checked the wound and there were indentations around the wound like human teeth. Are you sure the boy's brother didn't bite him?" My father's hand balled into a fist. The doctor saw the look in my dad's eye and immediately backpedaled. "I'm just asking because the bite marks were consistent with human teeth and the boy's been saying Josh over and over since we put him on anesthetic." My father's arm dropped. "My son would never..." The doctor apologized and said I would have to have a plaster mold of my teeth and a psychiatric evaluation. Just in case, he said. I couldn't believe it. I looked at my father and he just sighed and consented to the evaluation. For 3 hours, every weekday for the rest of the month, I sat in a bleached white room answering questions given to me by an older woman in Coke bottle glasses and a clawing, condescending voice. My answers felt completely irrelevant. "Did you ever have violent tendencies towards your brother or other people?" I said no, and she asked me to think harder, to try remember everything. She would second guess everything I said in the tone of voice you'd talk to a dog with. It was embarrassing, being told to answer honestly and then being told your honest answer was not consistent with your honest answer the day before, or that you should think more clearly about your honest answer. I was eventually cleared. Even with a plaster mold of my teeth, I still feel I probably wouldn't have been if my father hadn't walked in on us one day with a newspaper in his fist. He slapped it down on the psychiatric's desk and opened it to a page reading, "Local fisherman catches river monster." The lady looked to my father, My father looked at me. They knew I was right all along, and I wish I wasn't. The fish was laid out in the pictures. It had the same sloping head and broad fins, and at the bottom was a picture of its open mouth. It had a row of square, flat, human-looking teeth, and they were stained pink with blood. My brother recovered well. He still has a scar on his calf and walks with a slight limp, but the real damage isn't something you can see, like the nightmares. He would turn and writhe in his bed like a snake on fire. His sheets would be damp with sweat. They were always silent nightmares, except for this one time he woke up Mum and Dad. He didn't even know he was screaming. He told them the fish had come and dragged him down the bathtub drain to the deepest, darkest water. Then the fish would eat him alive, tearing him open like paper and eating his insides as they slid out of him in the icy blackness. My mum put him on sleeping medication for a while, but that didn't help very much at all. In my second year of high school, we moved away, and that seemed to have helped more than anything. The nightmares stopped. He settled back into his old self. He still will not get into any water, not even swimming pools. Once we went to a zoo and aquarium, and the sight of the alligator enclosure made him run back toward the bird exhibit. I don't remember where the creek was exactly, but I'm fine with that.